All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. We have two great debate competitors, J.L. Warren and an Iconoclast. Today, we're going to be doing a structured debate over the question, does the Christian God exist? With this, Iconoclast is going to be taking the affirmative, and J.L. Warren is going to be taking the negative. We're going to start out with the format. And I've gone over this with both J.L. and Iconoclast, but just so the audience knows, there's going to be an affirmative introduction, which will be Iconoclast, so that'll take about 5 minutes. And then there's going to be a negative introduction, which is J.L. Warren. That'll be 5 minutes as well. And then we'll do a cross-examination on both sides. So the affirmative will start first with that. That's 30 minutes. You're in control of your time there. Basically, with that, it's your time to do whatever you want with, right? You're asking JL questions, that type of thing, right? Just try to be polite there. The negative cross-examination will be 30 minutes after that. That's JL Warren. That's time you're in charge of, and I'll go into more detail on that here in a second. Then we'll have audience questions after the cross-examination, which should take about 20 to 30 minutes. If we get a lot of good questions and you guys want to take some more, we can always increase that. Or if there's not many questions, which I think there will actually be a lot of, but if there's not many questions, we can go for like 20 minutes, right? But if you guys are cool with it, don't be afraid to take some more questions. Then there's going to be the affirmative closing, which will be, once again, Iconoclast. That'll be 5 minutes. And then JL will close out the event with his closing, which will be 5 minutes. After that, if people want to stay around and chat, we can have pull up some people on the stage and we can talk about how the event went. Totally up to the audience, though. That's not mandatory. Now, with this, I'd like the two of you to be respectful to each other. I know you're both very respectful, so that shouldn't be an issue. Do your best to stay on the main topic. The goal here for JL is to provide good reasons to believe the Christian God does not exist. And the goal of Iconoclast is to provide good reasons to believe the Christian God does exist, right? You guys are both taking a different side of that question. There's going to be no over-talking during the introductions and closing statements at all. The person that's doing the introduction or closing is in full control over that time, and they should be the only one talking. After that, during the cross-examination, either debater can take back their time if they feel like it's going off into the weeds or whatever the case may be. If the person who has time on the cross-examination asks a question, please try to address that question directly and answer the question. You're also welcome to have a little bit of a back and forth there. That's your time, right? You're in full control over that. The person whose turn it is on the cross-examination is the one asking the questions, though. So try not to ask a bunch of questions during their time, right? You might have a clarification question. Hey, could you please clarify that for me or something like that, right? But try not to go and just start asking a bunch of questions during their cross-examination time, because that's what yours is for. Keep the over-talking to a minimum. Try not to constantly over-talk each other, right? Please try to interject in a polite way, right? Or at a fair time. Please allow your interlocutor to make their points. Please don't over-talk them when they're making a point and make it so that people can't hear what they're trying to say there. If you do have to interject during the crosstalks, I'd recommend asking, hey, may I interrupt? Or do you mind if I jump in? Or may I provide input here if you feel like what you said is being miscategorized or strawmanned or something like that, right? If interruptions or over-talking are constant, moderation abilities may be utilized to protect either the affirmative or the negative's time. I'm going to do everything I can to be a good moderator and be unbiased here. If you guys have any questions, now will be the time. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and get started.
No questions here. Good to see you, JL. Cool. Thanks for having me on Taco. Should be a good time.
Cool. So let's do a quick introduction for both of y'all, and then we'll go ahead and move into the introduction. So since you're doing the affirmative, Iconoclast, you want to just introduce yourself real quick and say where they can find you online? I think I linked you online, but if I didn't, I'll get that updated. But do you want to just tell a little bit about you and your platform?
Sure. Don't really have much of a platform, but I'm happy to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to tangle with one of the most existential questions facing humanity and one of the most hotly debated ones. JL and I have tangled over different things before. He's always been a good faith interlocutor as far as I can tell. So I'm looking forward to a good debate. And thank you for the plug on the YouTube channel that I'm trying to get off the ground. I certainly appreciate that. But with that, I mean, really not much to know about me personally. Aside from I'm here to prove God. So here we go.
Cool. I think all my links broke when I went live, but I'll fix that later. It's pretty easy to fix, just not at this exact moment. And now, JL, go ahead and introduce yourself real quick and tell people where to find you.
Sure. My name is JL. I am a YouTube content creator. I do pretty much content on, atheism, theology, philosophy, science, all manner of stuff that interests me. You can find me at JL Warren. You'll recognize it because the name of the channel is my YouTube channel is Bridge the Divide. Been a while since I've been in a debate, so I'm really, really excited about this. So it should be a good time. Appreciate everybody coming out, and definitely follow the politics server if you haven't yet. Jump on the server with us, especially for the Q&A. If you do, follow Breakfast Tacos, Iconoclast. Their links are in the description of this live stream on my channel. So let's have a good time. Thank you, Taco.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you both of y'all. It's a pleasure to have both of y'all here in this awesome debate. That we'll go ahead and begin with the affirmative introduction. That's going to be 5 minutes. I'm starting the timer here in just a second. Iconoclast, let me know when you're ready and you can begin. I'll just start the timer when you say you're ready.
I'm ready to rock and roll. Let's get it.
All right, go ahead and go.
Well, guys, again, thank you for having me on. This is going to be a fun debate, I do hope. And with that, let's get into it. I don't think this is going to be a typical prove the God thing debate. I'm setting out to do what is largely considered to be the impossible by absolutely proving God to be true, and not only proving the God to be true, but the Christian God by way of demonstrating that this omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient being must be Trinitarian in nature, and that this extends into all possible worlds grounded in our own, using a variety of different argumentations. And let's start with the principle of sufficient reason, that everything that exists must have a cause or an explanation for its existence. Then we're going to move into some teleological claims as to the fine-tuning of the universe. But this isn't going to be the typical your daddy's fine-tuning argument, I would say. And then we're going to conclude with the logical impossibility of what I've dubbed a mindless causal agent. And I understand that, this might get some hairs up, but when I say causal agent, this is almost an act of charity on my part, granting the causality and the agency to whatever mindless instantiating force might have given rise to the universe and any alternative possible explanation. So this is not an argument from probability or faith, but of formal proof. My claim is that denying the conclusion requires denying either logic itself or the reality we observe. So to do that, I'm going to present a formal structure. Our universe operates according to precise mathematical laws. This is an empirical fact. These laws require exact relationships between the constants, and I can demonstrate this by way of introducing what's called bijective functionality or a bijective function. Then we're going to move on to disprove the mindless causal agent by a process that we're going to disprove the existence of a mindless causal agent as a process that cannot generate precise mathematical relationships, which is a logical necessity. And then I think that by way of eliminative deduction, we will arrive at the place that a mind is necessary to explain these relationships, and this mind must have specific attributes that match Christian theism. So, by the end of this, it is my goal to prove that any attempt to refute this proof must either deny the observable reality that we live within and that all empiricism depends upon, accept logical contradictions, or demonstrate how a mindless process can generate precise mathematical relationships. Make sure I've got everything. Yeah, I think that pretty much does it for my intro. Kick it over to you, JL.
Perfect. Let me stop the timer real fast, and I'll start one for JL. JL, let me know when you're ready, and I'll go ahead and start your timer.
All right. Yep. Ready.
Starting it now.
Thank you to Taco and the Politics Discord for holding this debate, and thank you to Iconoclast for agreeing to take the affirmative position. The purpose of this debate is to examine the question, does the Christian God exist? This, of course, means there's going to be a lot of information to get to, so I'll try my best to convey that as succinctly as I can. Now, the Christian God itself can be understood to be a fairly nebulous concept that takes many different forms depending upon one's affiliation with any particular major family of Christianity or any particular denomination within those major families. It can also be argued that because there is no mind-independent referent for what a God category actually is, any asserted definition for that category, which ostensibly would be anything the claimant happens to be subjectively putting into that category, renders the category as ambiguous and thus incoherent. Furthermore, if it is conceded that such an entity cannot be demonstrated to exist independently of mind and context without begging the question, such an entity would be subject to elimination from all debate contention via the philosophical principle of Alder's razor. But for the purposes of this debate here today, I've identified three definitional attributes of the Christian God that, while not universally held as true by all Christians, are held as being true by the majority of those in the faith. These three attributes are as follows. 1. The God possesses a perfect nature. 2. That the God is omniscient, knowing all true propositions infallibly as an extension of its perfect nature. And 3. That the God possesses a plan, which entails the entity is categorized as an independent entity with a mind or a mind in its entirety, possessing agency, which can also be articulated as volition, free will, or the capacity to make choices absent impediment or incentive. From here, it is from those understood attributes, perfection, omniscience, and agency, that the Christian God is defined in a logically contradictory way, thus entailing that it itself is a logical contradiction, thus it cannot exist. The logical contradiction here is expressed by the position that an omniscient entity, knowing all true propositions infallibly, a set of knowledge that is entailed to include the entire set of true propositions that are its own actions, cannot logically choose a course of action that violates its own perfect or infallible knowledge of any action it has yet to take. If such an agent were able to take an action in direct opposition of its infallible knowledge, that capacity would violate the definitional attributes of perfection and by extension omniscience and would express a logical contradiction. The only logical conclusions from here are 1. That the God is omniscient and thus is relegated to nothing more than a non-agential function that simply does what it does because it cannot do differently, which is expressed by concepts like the deistic version of God that Einstein identified. Or 2, that the God is not omniscient, which would indicate that its nature is not perfect and such an entity cannot be ultimate. This is definitionally not the Christian God in any sense of mainstream Christianity, but instead would be some version of a God being held to by an extreme fringe Christian group, defined specifically to avoid these recognized logical contradictions. Of course, if my opponent disagrees with this generally accepted version of the Christian God, we can certainly address that alternate version and the justifications they have for asserting they possess the knowledge that such an unfalsifiable variant is something that exists. As for my appeal to logical consistency, the evidence-backed and parsimonious philosophical position that supports this understanding of logic is, of course, regulatory theory. That the laws of logic, while prescriptive for human reasoning, are descriptive, not prescriptive of the universe itself. But as my opponent holds to the opposing position of necessitarianism, that the laws of logic are prescriptive of the universe, themselves being prescribed by a God entity with the specific intention of creating a universe that gives rise to human beings, then I look forward to a few things. 1, a demonstration of the existence of the God and its possession of the necessary attributes in order to eliminate the foundational circularity of necessitarianism. 2, an explanation of how, if the laws of logic do not supersede the God and thus do not apply directly to it, how such an entity can contradictorily exist and not exist simultaneously. 3, an explanation of any logical contradiction in the non-theistic worldview that would render it impossible instead of purely relying upon personal incredulity. And 4, a predictive model that utilizes the data of the hypothesized God and its attributes to make more accurate predictions about reality than the evidence-backed models we currently employ. Now, stepping beyond this initial examination of logical entailments, the argument of this God's existence will invariably boil down to one's justification for making claims about external reality. Examining if the positive claimant is only relying upon belief without rational justification, or faith, which itself is not a tool for epistemology. Or, in fact, possesses the rational justification for asserting that their personal phenomenological experience, being that which they are convinced of as being true, can be demonstrated to be true, independent of mind and context, without begging the question, which, if necessary, I will address in cross-examination. Thank you again to Taco, the Politics Discord, my interlocutor, and the audience for this opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you both of y'all for y'all's introductions. I did forget to mention, I think, that you'll be able to raise your hand here shortly. So if you're not on the server, make sure you hop on. You'll be able to raise your hand here shortly, ask a question. Also on my stream, which I linked in the debate chat, and you can talk in the debate chat if you need a text chat. But on my stream, I have a question and answer section. It doesn't cost you anything to submit a question. It just keeps it super organized for me. It's really easy to manage there. Now, we'll go ahead and begin with the affirmative cross-examination. That's going to be 30 minutes. And so, Iconoclast, that's going to be the time that you're in control of. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll go ahead and start the timer. He may have had to step away for a moment. He did mention he had some stuff going on.
But
You ready?
yeah, I believe I'm ready. Yeah, I believe so.
Starting the timer now.
All right, Mr. J.L. Warren, I do have some questions for you. So let's get those pulled up because I don't believe that the atheist worldview is capable of providing sufficient answers to the questions that I have. Okay, that's my references.
Just to be clear, just to clarify, are these questions that pertain to like belief in a god, or the not believing that a god or gods exist? Or are these going to be because I want to make sure that they're entailed by the atheist worldview? So that would simply be the lack of belief, or like lacking belief, or not possessing a belief. But if it's questions to something else, like a philosophical position, I just want to make sure that we understand that specific philosophical or scientific positions are not entailed by the atheist position.
I understand that, and I will try to keep it well within the bounds of the topic at hand. But I would like to start with some foundational questions, if we could, just so that we can lay the groundwork, as it were, for what we do and do not believe and what the entailments of those positions would be. So I think I'd start off with asking you, would you agree that mathematical equations describe physical reality?
Yes, I agree that mathematics is a logical language of quantification for things that we observe. Yes. They describe things, yes.
And would you agree that these mathematical equations are precise and not approximate?
From our frame of reference in the universe, yes.
Cool. And would you agree that specific mathematical expressions in regards to the cosmos are true and accurate, specifically those of like the universal constants, for instance? And would you accept that, for instance, that the gravitational constant remains the same across space and time?
They appear to be, yes. As far as we know, and all experimentation shows, they appear to be. It does not say whether or not they are intended to be that way.
That's fair. That's fair. And do you accept that these constants maintain their precision to multiple decimal places, like absolute precision values?
In some instances, yes.
Okay, when it specifically speaks to gravity, would that be in one of those instances?
Yeah, the understanding that gravity is a phenomenon that is understood by the relation of an object's mass in relation to space-time. Yes.
Would you care to enlighten me as to which universal constants you might take issue with, as far as may not be as precise as, say, gravity, for instance?
None so far. The predictive models pretty much they hold up by the predictive models, so I don't really have an issue with any of them.
Excellent, and that's my intention, is to start with empiricism, with the things that we could all appeal to as authoritative, regardless of religion, non-religion, theist, non-theist, anything like that. Because I think it's a fair place to start. One of neutrality, and work our way up using empiricism of science, mathematics, and logic, and through a process of eliminative deduction, see where the results take us, right? To determine what is possible, what is not possible, what is necessary, what is contingent, and so forth. So let me ask you this. How would you explain the origin of these precise mathematical relationships, such as the gravitational constant and the mass over which it governs?
So the way you ask that question is a little strange. So, like, we can begin measuring the universe at a certain point. What we call the origin point of observability, which we tongue in cheek call the Big Bang. That's where we can begin to measure the universe, and these things begin to come into play as understood by the mathematical models at a certain point after the cooling event, which is something like 400,000 years, somewhere around there, after the inflation event began. And so you say like that's the origin of it, but I guess you could say that's the opening, like that's the start where we can begin observing them or measuring them. So I don't say that we can explain we can explain mechanistically as to why we see those events as a result of the interaction of objects with mass with space-time, but there's nothing to indicate that there is any purpose for that or any reason why they are supposed to be that way. It's something we observe we observe that happening. So, as physics will tell you, as the field of physics itself describes, that the laws of physics and, of course, the mathematics behind it, the logic behind it, that these things are descriptive of the universe, not prescriptive.
So where else do we see this kind of mathematical precision arising out of mindless causation? I think that's a fair term. Is that a fair term, or is causation an issue?
Well, okay, so like assuming there's a cause, that's where the circularity comes into in necessitarianism that I mentioned in my intro. So when we talk about the precision of it, it's just the mathematical formulas and the equations that we derive, that we basically come up with, that we invent in order to describe what we are observing. And then we generate very, very precise mathematical models in order to facilitate really, really excellent predictive models, so that we can predict what's going to happen based upon what we observe now. But those are all in nature descriptive. They're describing these things. So the intricacy of the mathematics that we invent, or we kind of like develop in order to describe these things, as does not indicate that the universe is intended to be measured in that way, or is intended to like have these things as like prescriptive, like the universe operates in accordance with these things via prescription. That's not entailed by that. It's simply that the universe operates in a way, and we observe it, and we develop these mathematical models to make predictions upon what we observe. And the more accurate we can make them, the better those models are, and thus we have the mathematics that can do that.
Okay. Sorry, I kind of looking for a specific theorem that I believe speaks to this. Yes, Gödel's perhaps mispronouncing this, but Gödel's first incompleteness theorem states that any consistent formal system with a basic arithmetic contains true statements that cannot be proven within the system. What would you say to Mr. Gödel in this particular theorem in regards to how we can explain these this mathematical precision that we see specifically in regards to the universal constants and the material conditions over which they govern? I think that would be well within the system that contains the basic arithmetic and true statements that cannot be proven within it. Do I have that right?
Well, I failed to see what it has to do with this. You know, in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and also expressed in concepts like the halting problem, is that yes, there is going to be information that is not going to be verifiable by the system, and there's going to be information that's forever outside of our grasp. So these are just like statements in mathematics. But when we're talking about physical reality and the mathematics it represents, there's going to be information that's going to be forever beyond our access, which is, you know, just relegated. I mean, that's understood by relativity, by special relativity, and by mathematics itself. But these do not indicate that the math is prescriptively precise for this specific deal, because that implies, the question you're asking implies that there is an intention that these things are prescriptive, that the universe to be in this way in order to give rise to human beings, which is what I addressed in my intro, that the universe would have to be in a very, very specific way in order to specifically give rise to human beings. But that, of course, assumes that this universe is intended to give rise to human beings. But of course, that would be circular in nature, because you would be assuming that there is an intentionality, a thing with intention for humans to be intentional. So, which is why that's the core problem with necessitarianism, is that it's circular at its core. Regulatory theory, which is these things are merely descriptive of the universe because it works bottom up instead of top down. So regulatory theory simply labels these things as being descriptive of the universe without assuming with no demonstration that there is a thing that intends the universe to operate in this specific way to give rise to human beings. So you'd have to cover the gap. You'd have to cover the gap of the circularity of necessitarianism before any kind of like invoking of intentionality for the precision of mathematics.
Okay, so how would you describe forgive me, I forget the term that you used for it, but the descriptive system that you're appealing to? What's the name of that again? Would you remind me?
Regulatory theory. It's a philosophical position that the laws of logic, laws of physics, mathematics, and these things that the basic laws that we utilize are descriptive of the universe, because it starts from the position that the system exists, humans exist within the system, humans observe the system, and then we write down what we observe, and to articulate that information to other people, we write them down as accurately as we can, and then we develop explanatory and predictive models based on that, and these models, they describe what's happening, but they do not assume prescription. They're not held as even by the fields of mathematics or philosophy, mathematics or physics, or cosmology or astrophysics or whatever. These are not held as being prescriptive, because that would be circular in nature. That would be assuming something there to do the prescription to elicit a specific outcome, which would be, obviously, from the theistic worldview, the rise of human beings, because human beings are inherently special in that system. But that's not assumed in any formal scientific or mathematical or system or like system that we educate others on. So that's why regulatory theory is the prevailing system, the prevailing philosophical position there.
Okay. So would this regulation theory, would this it entail some sort of self-existing laws, or would brute
No.
contingency be a better way of describing them? I mean,
the only brute contingency would just be, I think you would go, the only brute contingency there would be like existence in and of itself, that things exist because they exist, and which would just be tautological. But by virtue of what we understand with predictive models of the universe, that the universe fundamentally is energy, and that as far as we understand, that energy can either be created or destroyed, so it simply changes states. So ostensibly, the universe is energy, and that energy has always existed, thus the universe has always existed. It just exists in different states. So that you could trace it back to that, but regulatory theory simply holds about the observer observing the universe, the system that they're in, and describing what that is. So, like I said, the 2 points, necessitarianism versus regulatory theory, which I pointed out in my intro.
Okay. So if I have this understanding correctly with this regulation theory, it states that these universal laws just simply exist without an external cause, kind of akin to Platonic realm of eternal forms or something like this.
They don't hold that they exist in that manner, that these are abstracta. These are abstracta that we utilize to describe things.
Okay.
Just like mathematics is an abstracta, these are all abstracts. These are like all languages are abstract. They're abstractions that we utilize to convey information from one party to another through communication. Mathematics does just that. It's a descriptive language of quantification that allows us to quantify the objects that we observe and allows us to pass that information to other people in a coherent fashion, because logic is prescriptive of human reasoning, as far as we can tell, just the way we convey information in a coherent fashion, but they are descriptive of the universe.
So, and part of that descriptive is that somehow, some way, we landed on the lucky happenstance of, out of the nearly infinite, I can't really say infinite, but the astronomically large possible ways that the universe could have existed or not existed if these constants were any different, that this infinite range of possible values was just, it is what it is. There's nothing that instantiates it or determines it.
Well, there's not enough data. We don't have enough data from prior states of the universe to determine what is the range of like logically possible systems that can exist. As far as the constants, we know that we know from mathematical models that if you adjust one constant, that you will invariably affect the other constants as well, and that when you start tweaking things, you can get a wildly different universe, or a universe that collapses in itself, or a universe that expands out like all of a sudden and just like reaches thermal equilibrium. But these are all mathematical projections. As far as we know, we don't have enough data to say that this universe is the only kind that it can exist, or this universe is not the only kind that can exist. We do know that we have this universe. We simply don't have enough data about prior states before what we call the Big Bang to try. There's a lot of hypothetical models out there, but nothing concrete, nothing with enough data to create a predictive model that we can't even really experimentally test these things. So we're talking about like hypotheticals that are all over the place in that respect. Like, if you want to get into things like multi-world theory or anything like that, but the regulatory theory only holds that it doesn't make the assumption that these things are intended, that they're prescriptive, that there is an intention behind these things. Okay, we understand the constants to be what they are, and that the understanding of those constants are predicated upon our frame of reference in the universe. And so we know that that frame of reference can change depending upon the state of the universe. So they are the way they are, the way we understand them now, but we don't assume the existence of something to prescribe them. So therefore, we don't describe that. We don't like assert them as being prescriptive. We assert them only as being descriptive until such prescribing entity can be demonstrated to exist.
And you would agree with me that if we were able to describe this intentionality, right, behind this prescriptive agent, then that would necessitate, therefore, the existence of at least some sort of deity or at least some sort of godlike entity that exists outside or exterior from space-time, matter, and energy that was capable of instantiating these things prior to time beginning. Would that be a fair assessment? I'm not asking to say.
Not necessarily, and saying that something could instantiate time, which would, I mean, invariably by saying that it's actualizing or instantiating anything implies a temporal concept. So trying to instantiate time from outside of time is odd because there would be a before the instantiation and an after, which would be logically contradictory. So saying that temporal states don't apply to this entity in and of itself and the way it operates is odd. It's just, it seems very logically contradictory. I mean, you can't even have the temporal differences between mental states
From our frame of reference, though, right? That's just from our frame of reference, because all we understand is the temporal state of within the time, the constraint of time.
Well, we would have to be able to describe it. So from a mathematical perspective, time exists as a line from our frame of reference. So there's the what we understand to be the past, present, future, B theory of time, and that we are moving in one direction. And so the arrow of time. But for an entity like God, time either exists as a line or it exists as a point. So it's either presentism for the God, or the God is also subject to B theory as well, B or C theory, however that may be. But if you're describing it as being outside space-time, well, then that means that it occupies no point for no time, which is odd because if itself is a mind and minds are non-quiescent by definition, then there are temporal states. Then there are temporal states of thought to action. There is a before actualization and a prior to actualization, which indicates a temporal state, but that wouldn't be able to be measured in a non-time or non-temporal, articulation. So it would be incoherent. It would just be like an appeal to magic, like it makes it happen somehow, or it's an appeal to mystery in the respect that it's just it's justifiable or it's reconcilable, but we just don't know how it's reconcilable. But it's basically an expression of an incoherent concept.
So the claim is through regulation theory that somehow, some way, the universe just is, absent any further needed explanation. That
I think I have to correct something. When you're calling it regulatory, it's regulatory theory, okay? But it's not like a theory. Yeah. It's not theory like a scientific theory. There's necessitarian theory and there's regulatory theory, and these are just philosophical positions, but they're not theories in the scientific sense. Just to make sure that I'm just to make sure like the audience understands that comes across. It's not like an evidence-backed predictive model that says that. No, it's a philosophical position that informs us going. Actually, technically, it's a philosophical position that you fall on by virtue of the evidence in the predictive model. And to make sure you're holding the most parsimonious position, not multiplying your entities unnecessarily, and not begging the question at the core. So regulatory theory, because it's not circular at the core.
Okay. So just so I understand this correctly, where regulatory bottoms out, or the regress of asking why or how something came to be, they just kind of circumvents that by saying it just is what it is. Is that accurate? I'm really not.
Well, there's two different why. There's two different whys there. There's the why from a mechanistic perspective, and there's the why from a like an intentionality perspective. And so regulatory theory is just that doesn't handle whys. That's where scientific theories come in. Scientific theories and laws that describe the universe. The laws say what is. The laws tell us what is, and the theories tell us why. So that would be the mechanistic explanations behind why we see things the way they are when we're explaining various phenomena. But they're not. I
don't want to get into the intentionality yet. That's not
but there's no evidence of intentionality there. You'd have to assume that something is intended to exist, and so you have to justify that intentionality, which is regulatory theory doesn't do that. Necessitarianism does.
Let's do that then. Let's get into seeing if we can find our way to some kind of intentionality. I'd like to start off by just claiming some pretty basic fine-tuning argument values and probabilities. And when I'm done, we can re-examine them. And if you need me to pause at any given point, just let me know so that we can examine a claim further if that's what you want to do, or if you just want to, acknowledge that there are plenty of experts in the fields of cosmology, astrophysics, theoretical physics, and these other things that hold these claims to be, or not hold them, but affirm them to be valid. So I'll just start off with this, that the universe operates under mathematically constrained physical constants that must exist in any physical universe comprising of space, time, matter, or energy. And that these constants, specifically that of gravity, fine structure, and cosmological constants, are numerically exact within unimaginably small margins. Would you agree with me so far?
No.
Okay. What part of it do you take issue with?
So the mathematics in and of itself, I mean, if we're talking about like the universe in and of itself and like the nature of the universe, so the mathematics that we use to describe certain things can be very, very precise. But when we're talking about like, ultimately we're talking about fine tuning, and fine tuning cannot overcome the observer bias problem is what it is that when you're perceiving the universe from a specific frame of reference and then assuming that the universe is intended to be viewed and intended to be measured or observed from that specific frame of reference, these are like assumptions that you can't get past because they're going to be circular. You're going to be begging the question of the thing that has the intention to do this particular thing. So given that we don't have the mathematical functions to derive anything about about probability, given that we have like a sample size of one, we have one universe to interact with. Deriving these probabilities is by all my understanding is, I'm not a mathematician, but it's been explained to me that this is impossible. That trying to derive the probabilities of these things when we have a sample size of one universe with life in it that we understand it, then all we can get is that a universe like this bears life if the conditions are accurate. That's what the evidence tells us. So
right, but I haven't made any claim towards this being finely tuned. I'm just citing to the data from a fine tuning argument, and I have the white paper I provided if you'd like.
Well, the fine-tuning argument is just a modern version of the teleological argument, which is the purpose thing. Is like, what is the purpose of this thing? What is the purpose of life? That assumes that there is a purpose. And the teleological argument falls on its face because it assumes that the God exists and is defined a specific way without it being demonstrated. So it's arguing from the position that a God exists and that is defined a specific way.
Hold on. I'm only citing the data from the fine-tuning position. I'm not asserting that the purpose or the intentionality of the fine-tuning argument that hasn't even come into my line of questioning yet. So I appreciate the attempt at preemptively rebutting it, but I'm just trying to establish the baseline if we could, and I don't want to get caught up in arguments that haven't even been posited yet, if that's fair.
Well, if I've already rebutted, there's no point in really continuing with fine-tuning because, like I said, you can't overcome the observer bias problem.
Well, maybe we can get there, but first we got to get through some data. So it's not an issue of taking umbrage with the constants being exactly what they are. The issue that you presented so far is one of the intentionality or the observer problem, right? So far we could agree then that it is that the universe operates under mathematically constrained physical constants that must exist in the physical universe, comprising space, time, matter, and energy. Like there have to be, like we'll call those material conditions, the space, time, matter, and energy for the purpose of the conversation. And there has to be governing laws over them that are interdependently connected, right? So, like for instance,
this is the problem with that. Is that yes, and the answer to that would be yes if it was if it was, the answer to that would be yes if it was intended for humans to be articulating these things in this way. That's the problem.
I don't think that's necessarily the case.
It is. It's what's entailed. It's what's entailed by fine tuning. That's the formation of the teleological argument that these things are this way specifically so that humans can articulate them this way, they can recognize them, and then trace them back to the thing that has the intention. That's the circular nature of the argument in and of itself. So no,
I'm
we
not
don't
even
make them.
making jail.
We don't make
Stop.
those
Stop.
assumptions. We
Stop.
don't make those assumptions.
Jail. This is my time, and you keep arguing with something that I haven't even put forward yet. All I'm doing is looking at data. For instance, the values associated with
5
these
minutes
constants.
remaining.
5 minutes remaining.
You're articulating it in a way that is not representative of the field.
Iconoclast requested to take his time back over. Just let him go where he's going. There's 5 minutes
That's
left.
cool. Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, so far it's an intentionality dispute that we're arriving at, but the claims in the fine-tuning argument, the empirical claims, don't necessitate any kind of intentionality. They draw that as an inference into the conclusion, but building on the premises of the data specifically, I think that we can establish a pretty strong baseline, such that there is a interdependent relationship between, say, gravity and the mass over which it governs. So if the mass were different to gravity, the value of gravity's constant would be different, and the value of gravity's constant were to be different, then the mass would behave differently. But since we know that things are the way they are, we know that these things are such as the constants themselves being so precise to very unimaginably narrow margins, such that if gravity were to change in any given direction, whether it be stronger or weaker, to JL's point that you made a little bit ago, that would create all kinds of issues with the existence of the universe at all. So what I'd like to do is construct a hypothetical scenario in which I'd grant maximum charity to any kind of mindless causal agent, whether that's through contingency, naturalistic mechanisms, stochastic emergence, whatever you want to call it. So please don't get hung up on the mindless causal agent. This is an umbrella term used to describe any possible explanation that does not entail some kind of a mindful intelligence with intent that does this instantiating. So in that effort, I'm going to go ahead and grant this mindless causal agent one attempt per Planck time, per Planck second, since the initial inflation event, which calculated at 14.5 billion years, which is about 700,000 years overboard or high, according to most Big Bang cosmology models right now. So call it 14.5 billion. And that gives us a value of about 10 to the 61st power number of Planck seconds. And we're going to grant this mindless causal agent an instantiation attempt per Planck second since the Big Bang initial inflation event occurred. Now, the values of these constants, being what they are, is so precise that any deviation between these constants or the material conditions over which they govern is described, and this is a claim of the fine-tuning argument that experts like Penrose, Weinberg, who else? Belinkin, Guth, Krauss, and others would affirm, Sean Carroll, for instance, would affirm as being valid. The value of that, or the probability of that, or these constants and material conditions being what they are, exactly as they are, is 1 over 10 to the 122nd power, which, for a little bit of reference, the number of atoms estimated to be in the physical universe is 10 to the 80th power, give or take. So if we grant this mindless causal agent the maximum number of instantiation attempts that is feasibly possible within our physical universe, that comes to 10 to the 61st, which is the number of Planck seconds available since the inflation event, calculated at 14.5 billion years. Now, the problem with this is that the probability of any kind of mindless causal agent arriving at these specifically precise values is 10 to the negative 59th power, which leaves us well above the threshold. I think it's Borel's law that states that the statistical impossibility threshold is 10 to the negative 43rd power.
1 minute.
So if that is the case, then it is a justifiable deduction to conclude that any kind of mindless causal agent that instantiated this universe with these precise, mathematically precise values would still fall below the threshold of what is statistically or otherwise described as physically impossible by Borel's law at 10 to the negative 43rd power. So what this leads us to is that the statistical impossibility of this agent demands the necessity of a necessary agent and that is required to determine and instantiate these material conditions and the physical laws governing them in an interdependent relationship, i.e., gravity, the constant having a direct effect on the mass, and the mass also having a direct effect on the value of the constant. And the problem with this is this has to happen at Planck time 1, the exact moment that the inflation began. Otherwise, the evolution of the cosmos that we can see through Newtonian mechanics and Einstein's relativity.
That's time, but you can finish your statement.
Sure. Well, all these things must have occurred at exactly Planck time 1, because there was no Planck time. There was no time prior to Planck time 1, and any result that would not be these things at Planck time 1 necessitates a universe that either doesn't exist or exists in a wildly different state than it currently is.
Okay, thank you. And JL, your cross-examination will begin when you're ready. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll start the timer.
Terrific.
You ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool.
This is probably not gonna. I'm probably not gonna take all of the time, so this is gonna be pretty simple. Iconoclast, are you claiming to believe your God exists, or are you claiming that you know that this entity exists?
I'm claiming that I know this entity exists through a number of various ways. A, through personal experience, which I realize is anecdotal and I cannot transfer to anybody exterior myself, and I wouldn't expect to. But I think that it's also, I think that I can also demonstrate that we can, using only empirical methodologies and mathematics and logic, arrive at the conclusion that this God that I believe in necessarily exists.
But that, of course, would assume that the God exists and is defined in a very, very specific way. So can you demonstrate that this God exists independently of mind and context without begging the question?
Independent. Can you, I'm sorry, ask that question again a little bit slower so I can fully understand it, so I can respond to it properly, if you would.
Can you demonstrate that this God exists independently of mind and context without begging the question?
Independently of mind and context without begging the question. So what exactly does that entail? Does that entail the ability to describe what is and is not possible? Because I believe that would depend on context, being our physical universe and our reality within it. And mind independent, well, I mean, contextually, we have to have a mind in order to make observations, even with empiricism. So how exactly? It seems like you're asking for an impossible bar to hurdle with context and mind independence here.
No, it's actually entailed by the claim that you know it to be true. So there's a differentiation between belief and knowledge at a core level. And so the idea being that if you believe a thing is true because you're convinced it's true, a la doxastic involuntarism, then that's something that's in your mind. You believe it to be true because you've been convinced of that. That's your phenomenological experience. That's fine. But the problem is when you are jumping the gap from your phenomenological to the noumena, essentially anything in external reality. So if you're claiming that you know it, that it exists and you know it to be true, you know that it exists, then the entailments of that are that it has the property of existence, which it would necessitate, which it needs in order to do any of the things that you think it's doing or you've been convinced it's doing. So it has to exist first. And then you're saying that you know it, meaning it's a knowledge proposition about reality, about external reality, because ostensibly this God has its own identity. It's not equal to us, so the God is the God. So therefore, it can be demonstrated to exist independently of minds, meaning that if no minds existed, no humans existed, the God would still be there. Just like if no humans existed, the universe would still be here. So the idea being that if this thing is independent of mind and context, if it exists independently of mind and context, meaning that it's there, independent of our interpretations or our experiences, then you should be able to demonstrate that it is there without begging the question, which means pointing at something as being evidence of its existence without demonstrating that it is. So like if you were to point at, like the fine-tuning argument, like point at the universe, say that's evidence of the God. Well, that assumes the God exists in order to do the creating. That would be begging the question. That's what necessitarianism is doing, where it's assuming the agent with the intention in order to facilitate a universe that is intended to bring about a specific outcome, which is the rise of human beings. So can you do that? Can you demonstrate that this entity exists independently of mind and context without begging the question?
So I'm not allowed to appeal to, say, the existence at all. So, for instance,
No, you would
Let me
be.
think about it.
You're asserting it, but you just need to be able to demonstrate that it does.
Okay, so if I were to point to the existence of the universe, right, which would be independent of our minds as say humans didn't exist within it, which I'm not making the intentionality claim that the universe was instantiated so such that humans would exist by making this claim, only to say that this thing, which is the universe, does in fact exist and analyze the exact the necessary um, things or the parameters that must be the case if this is to exist. Would that be a fair way to answer that?
That'd be begging the question.
Begging the
If
question.
you,
So existence itself is begging the question.
No, the
I don't
existence of
understand how
anything.
this
No,
is
no,
not
no,
a loaded
no, no.
question.
The existence of everything other than the God itself. You can point to the universe. You can point to the Bible. You can point to the universe. You can point to anything you want. But ultimately, for those things to be evidence of the thing you claim exists, you'd have to demonstrate that it exists first for those things to be evidence of it. So therefore, you'd have to demonstrate that it actually exists independently of mind and context to be a thing that in external reality that is being referenced for those things to be evidence of it. Otherwise, it's just an abstracted that is in your mind that you've been convinced is true, but you can't demonstrate to be true. Therefore, you can't claim that you know it to exist, but you do believe it to exist. So this
Well,
applies across. This applies across the board. Plus, there's you need to a good way. There's two good ways of doing this that I can go and feed them to you. There is you can show the logical contradiction in the non-theistic worldview, like there's a logical contradiction there that shows that it's impossible, like I said in my intro, or
I'd be happy to.
Or you can, well, I mean, like I said, to show the impossibility. But if you're defining a thing as a particular way in order to generate that, then that's going to be problematic. But we can get to that if necessary. Or you can provide a predictive model utilizing the God hypothesis and the data from it in order to generate a better predictive model than the evidence ones that we employ today. So both of those were in my intro. So can you do either of those?
Yes, I don't think I had to be doing any question begging in order to get there. I think that by pointing to the universe's existence itself, without any kind of theological claims there alongside it, what we can do is, by a process of deductive elimination, ask ourselves what is possible and what is not possible within this very narrow framework of the universe existing itself. And I think that by doing this, it would not beg the question because it's not assuming the entailed result, but it's simply analyzing any possible explanation for the existence of the universe within these parameters that we observe through empiricism and can mathematically identify and make predictive models out of that you even agreed to are extremely accurate, such that it's except these things are not considered scientific theories per se, but more so scientific laws, right? And I think that would be a way to avoid the question begging while also building a case for the existence of this creator. And I think that this can be done by way of pointing to things like the simultaneity paradox, that these things had to be the case at the exact same time at the beginning of time itself. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an existence to have this very conversation within or observe anything at all, because either the universe wouldn't be here in its current form, or it would be here in a way that may or may not support life. There's a seemingly endless number of variable different physical universes that could or perhaps could not arise given the material conditions that we know and the physical laws that govern them. So if I was able to demonstrate that these things are, to your point earlier, are already existent within a bijective function, meaning that they're an interdependent causal relationship, such as gravity, for instance, or one constant to another, or one constant and
okay, but that does. I'm sorry, I got to jump in there because, well, you haven't demonstrated it because you don't have a population of probabilities that you don't have a population that you can of like sets of like samples that you can access. We only have a sample size of one, and you're making assumptions about that predicated upon hypothetical models. So the problem is that if you're defining it in a particular way, like you're still assuming the existence of the thing to have the intention to do the thing. Okay, the only outcome of this that would be that humans wouldn't exist, that humans as we are now, we wouldn't exist, which is not problematic. So it just means that humans do exist. But if humans are not assumed to be special, then we are merely results of the system itself, and that we're not an intended result, but we are a possible result. Well, that's where regulatory theory comes in. So, like I said before, where is the logical contradiction in the non-theistic worldview, in which these things are a result of natural unguided processes in a universe that simply changes states? It never did not exist, but it just changes states. So where is the logical contradiction there? Where is the A not the A not A?
Sure. This I think is by way of just time constraints alone, that the bijective relationship that the constants have with the material conditions over which they govern necessitates some sort of order instantiation, some sort of category application. And it's not necessarily the case that, for instance, that we cannot use probability to examine a set of one. This is done all the time. In fact, I can point you to a couple examples right off the top of my head. In medical diagnostics,
okay, so we're getting off. We're getting we're getting off in the weeds.
Hold on.
No, it's my time. We're getting off in the weeds, and I don't want us to get off in the weeds.
Answer your question.
The problem is, I'm cutting back to it. The problem is that you continue to assert these things as being prescriptive. Okay, but if you're going to continue
I haven't made a prescriptive claim yet.
The implication, Iconoclast.
I don't care about the implication. You can draw an implication from it, but I haven't made that assertion until I make the assertion. I prefer to be able to answer the question.
This is Iconoclast. One moment. JL took his time back. This is his time. He's in control of.
Okay, so you're still referring to these things as the probability of it, like the probability is so low, but the probability in respect to what, or in reference to what? And the only thing that there's to reference is the rise of human beings. Okay,
no.
If there's nothing intended,
that's not my assertion.
No, but that's the implication, is that if you keep addressing probability, like the probability is this, even though you don't have the mathematical functions in order to derive a probability from that, from what we currently have access to, then you're still assuming that there is an intentionality there. Okay, if you're going to address these things in the context of necessitarianism, then you need to address the circularity at the core of necessitarianism, which is the demonstration of the agent that has the intention to actualize a universe with the specific intention of giving rise to human beings that in turn turn around and recognize it. So, can you demonstrate that this entity exists independently of mind and context without begging the question, yes or no?
Yes, because these relationships between the material conditions and the laws that govern them require simultaneous instantiation at the precise laws.
No, they don't. They do not. They do not. They do not require simultaneous instantiation. There is no such thing as absolute simultaneity. Okay, they don't require that. They simply require energy moving in one direction, work being done. That's all they require, is work being done. Okay, so given that we don't understand enough about prior states of the universe, all right, the whole idea is the idea of this is, does the Christian God exist? And I feel that we are getting way too far away from that. You're claiming that you know it exists. That it is beyond a belief, that you know it to be true, that you know it to be true of external reality. That the implication there is that it can be demonstrated to be true, that it can be demonstrated that it exists independently of mind and context, that we don't have to point to anything in the universe to indicate that the thing exists, because if you simply point at the universe as evidence of its existence, but you haven't demonstrated that it exists, then you are begging the question. So, can you demonstrate that it exists independently of mind and context without begging the question?
I'm trying to, but you never let me get through a response because you keep asserting or you keep arguing with something that I haven't even asserted yet. So,
no, because you keep pointing at the universe. You keep pointing at the universe and statements made about it. But no, that does not indicate it exists, because it could simply be something other than your God, or like a deistic thing that is.
I'm sorry, Taco. Am I ever going to be able to answer a question? Because he's taking all the time by.
If you don't answer my question, Iconoclast. No, you're not.
Guys, let's calm down a little bit. JL, go ahead and ask your question, and then re-ask it, and then Iconoclast can respond.
So, if you point to something other than the God itself, you're begging the question. So, can you demonstrate that the God exists independently of mind and context without begging the question?
Yes. Now, may I try to do that? Fantastic. You assert that these things don't need to, these constants and material conditions don't need to arise simultaneously, but they do according to every physical model that's used, that empiricism is driving. That depends necessarily on the empiricism, the math and the science and the logic that is necessary for the atheist worldview to maintain, or the non-theist worldview to maintain, because they're the only things that provide any kind of explanatory power or predictive power to our existence at all, absent a God. So you would then have to contend with the experts in the field that say these things are necessarily simultaneous at Planck time 1 in order to reject the framework that I'm trying to build here, that demonstrates that absent an instantiating force, a mindful causal agent, all mindless causal agents fail to meet these requirements just by way of naturalistic explanations, such that at Planck time 1, these things had to be the case, and it had to simultaneously be the case, because if they weren't the case, then we wouldn't have the universe at all. So by saying that that you can't point to the universe because that's somehow begging the question, I reject that, because that's not the case.
It is the case. It absolutely is the case, because number one, these ideas like cosmologists, they don't state this, and I'm appealing not only to my own knowledge on this and the cosmologists I've spoken with, but the cosmologists that are currently in my live chat screaming that you're lying about the field. So I know that this is an appeal to popularity in this circle, or an appeal to authority, but nonetheless, no cosmologist I've ever spoken with has articulated these things in that way. I'm pretty sure that you got that from some fringe site, but no, the way you're articulating that is not correct. Okay, so but nonetheless, if you are pointing to something other than that, even if it were the case that what you're describing even if it were the case that what you're describing was correct, that still doesn't entail like the Christian God, which is what this debate is about. Okay, you could literally appeal to naturalistic deism, okay, with throw in with an appeal to mystery there, and that would still be completely and totally unfalsifiable, and you still wouldn't have the justification to say that the thing exists, which is what I addressed in my intro. That if you define this entity in a way that is completely unfalsifiable, then you can't make statements that it exists or doesn't exist, because you can't demonstrate it to be true or false, or true or not true either way. But we're talking specifically about the Christian God. Now, number one, you haven't addressed the logical contradiction that I brought up in the actual defining attributes of the God, because that defines it out of contention completely, which means that you're simply pointing to things that you are defining, or through personal incredulity, like I said in my intro, personal incredulity, that you don't see how they could be possible without a God. But there is no logical contradiction in the non-theistic worldview, which I asked you to point to, but you still haven't. So, given that, pointing to anything other than the God itself as an entity that exists external of your mind, external of mind and context, that it exists independent of us, that A equals A and A is not equal to not A, that God possesses itself, that the God set necessarily pre-exists the not God set. As in your worldview, the God set actualizes the not God set. So, can you determine this? Can you do these things? Can you show the logical contradiction there? Okay, but you can't. Can you demonstrate that it exists independent of mind and context without begging the question? You can't. And so the idea of this, if you wanted to find it into this kind of like unfalsifiable way, then it's pretty much just done, because you can't even state that thing exists at all. It doesn't logically follow that you could. It would just be you saying
you're rejecting the same. You're rejecting the same kind of empiricism that does state that these things must be the case, which is what I'm using to build my case for the existence of a deity at all.
No, I'm not.
Then to further build it into what that deity is, but we will never get there, because you just keep repeating the same thing ad nauseum while rejecting the very science and empiricism that your position is built on.
Yes.
And if you want the list of experts that agree with what I'm saying, I'd be happy to provide it to you, because I have an entire list right here, along with the works that they wrote, the prize. Oh, they don't? Okay,
they don't. So, but nonetheless, going off of that, the problem is that we don't have access beyond the Big Bang, the origin point of observability. We don't have access to that.
Exactly, which is what I'd like to be. That's what I'd like to begin the exploration of, but you won't let me. Every time I try to point to it, you say you're assuming a God. I'm saying no. I'm assuming that these things must be the case with the empiricism.
I would still like you to answer my very basic question: yes or no. Okay, can you demonstrate that it exists independently of mind and context without begging the question?
Would it be a demonstration that it exists independent of mind and context if there was, a statement towards the pre-existence of the universe and what necessarily would have been the case in order for the universe to exist?
Yes,
And
it
does
would
the
be
universe
begging the
exist?
question because yes, it would be
Oh,
begging the
okay.
question. No, it would be begging the question because you would be assuming things about states prior to the universe that we don't have access to.
No, I'd be performing an eliminative deduction of what can and cannot be the case as far as possibility goes, and it
Given
cannot be
that
the
logic,
case.
well, no, given that logic and method, given that logic, mathematics, physics, everything, our current understandings of these things break down at the quantum level, and they break down at the literally beyond the Big Bang or the origin point of observability. These things break
Planck
down
time one.
and are not quantifiable by any understanding we have right now. We have hypothetical
Yeah.
models predicated upon what we know on this side of observability, but you're assuming things about states prior to observability. In order
Do you
for
know
your
what the
thing-
threshold of observability is?
the Planck time.
Yes, Planck 1, exactly, Planck time 1. So what we do know is that Planck time 1, that certain things are the case and had to be the case for the cosmos to evolve in the way that it did. And if you need verification of this, all you need to do is look at Einstein's field equations, and those will tell you exactly what you need to know about why they had to be the case. Because if they
Yes,
weren't the
I
case,
get that. Yes, I
then
understand that. I understand that. You've already, I don't need you to
okay.
repeat it. I understand it, but that very
Oh,
thing
so
right
now
there.
repeating
No,
stuff.
but what you're talking about is like I mentioned in my intro, you're getting to where Einstein identified this kind of like functional deistic thing. It wasn't necessarily an agent, but it was a thing that does what it does because it can do no other, which is kind of like the naturalistic deism, where it's not really an agent in that respect, but it is this foundational thing that is operating the way, and that's the reason the universe is the way it is. But that's where Einstein got to. He didn't get to a Christian God. Okay? If you're trying to redefine the Christian God in a way that does not comport with mainstream or even fringe Christianity, that's an entirely different debate altogether. If you're talking about the Christian God, which is what this debate is about, the Christian God specifically, then obviously the things that are within the theology of Christianity are going to have to be connected to this thing. But for that theology to be true, you have to demonstrate that it first exists. Okay? At all. You have to demonstrate that the thing is a thing that it exists and we can make coherent statements about it. Now, I've already demonstrated that if you define it a particular way, you define it into logical contradiction and it doesn't exist at all. So, in that respect, if you're pointing to anything other than the God itself, you're still going to be begging the question. If you're assuming that humans are intended to exist, you're still going to be begging the question. Your reasoning is going to be circular at its core via necessitarianism. Okay? Now, given that this point, this is really all I had as far as like the knowledge claim that you're making. If you want to concede that you don't know it, but that you believe it to be true, that would be where you could go. But you can't demonstrate that you know it to exist. Therefore, you would have no justification to claim that it does exist. Whereas I can say that as defined, the Christian God does not exist simply because of the way it is defined. So they would have to redefine it in a way. The problem is they get closer and closer to unfalsifiability with that and no justification to say it exists. So I think I can end my cross there, Taco. I got my point across. If there's no demonstration that the entity exists independent of mind and context without begging the question, then there's no justification to say that it exists at all. One could say one believes, but you could never have the justification to say that you know.
You do have 8 minutes left. Are you sure you want to see the rest of your time?
Yeah, I'm good.
Cool. We'll go ahead and end that there. We're going to begin the audience question and answer. Now, for the people in the live stream and the audience, for the people on Discord, in the JL versus Icono debate channel, just click on the pinned link and you can submit a question there. If you're in the live stream now, you can simply just click the Q&A question thing and ask a question. There's a bunch in there right now. So I'm going to ask some questions now. Also, feel free to raise a hand if you'd like to come up here. I'll pull you up here and you can ask some questions. I'll start out with a couple questions in the Q&A, and then if there's any hands raised, I'll start pulling people up. Bear with me for just a minute. So I see actually just one question right now. So question for JL. How do you know that you couldn't have evolved into a brain in a vat?
The problem of hard solipsism. So currently, there is no solution to the problem of hard solipsism. I very well could be a brain in a vat, but there's no way for me to determine that. And even if I was, I would still be having an experience. So, but going a little bit further with the Nietzschean critique of that is that even the sense of self, which is a thing that is perceived, even that could be a projection. So at best we can confirm that an experience is being had, and then we presuppose the self is having the experience, and then we move forward from there. But yeah, there's currently no solution to the problem of hard solipsism, so I don't really concern myself with it.
Perfect. And does anybody in the that was the only question I saw right now. So if anybody wants to submit a question with the Q&A thing there. I'll check the chat too. If anybody would like to raise their hand, go ahead and raise your hand. I see God exists in the audience and Abysmo, so we'll pull them up one after the other. What's going on? God exists, Adam?
Hi. I just had a question about what JL was just talking about. So, for example, JL, you're asking Iconoclast for a contradiction. But if, for example, if somebody were to demonstrate a contradiction, doesn't that mean that you're kind of conceding that something is independent of your mind? Right? So if contradictions have to be false, then it seems to imply that there is a reason not to believe in solipsism, because that would be independent of your experience.
Well, there's no solution for it, so we can't determine it either way. Currently, we can't determine it either way. I'm not saying absolutely that we're not or absolutely that we are. Like I said, it's the problem of hard solipsism. There's no defeater for Descartes' demon, so we can't make further statements from there. All we can do is work with, an experience is being had. We can confirm that by the ability to doubt that experience. But is it the self that's doubting it, or is the sense of self even a projection, a la Nietzsche? So we even presuppose that. So we all kind of like hold that axiomatically as a part of a worldview, and of course, all worldviews get hung on hung on one of the horns, which is currently unavoidable. But I don't see why it's an issue. I don't really concern myself with the issue of solipsism because an experience is still being had. Whether I'm a brain in a vat or I'm a human being it exists in a world where there's an external reality, it's kind of irrelevant.
Does that answer your question, Adam?
I'm not sure. So my question was, if contradictions are false, and if they're false for all minds, the question was sort of more like, wouldn't that provide a basis for doubting solipsism, hard solipsism?
No, because there's no logical contradiction in hard solipsism being true, and that this is all a projection. Like I said, there's no defeater for Descartes' demon. There's no defeater for hard solipsism. Currently, no defeater for hard solipsism. If you were to show a logical contradiction, then yeah, you would then contradict. It would show it to be contradictory, and then it would be false. Then we could eliminate it, but we can't currently eliminate it because there is no logical contradiction in that being the case, which is Descartes, and then further Nietzsche identified that. So there's no logical contradiction there. It could very well be the case that all of reality is a projection. That in fact, in some Christian models, some theistic models, like the world and existence itself and everything that we perceive is just, God's perception. That we're all just that God is the ultimate solipsist, and that all of this is just a projection of its own mind. So there's some fields of thought that, or some theistic models that hold to that, but there's no defeater for it currently. I mean, if you could provide one, that'd be fantastic. You could eliminate hard solipsism, and you ring the bells of all philosophy across the board. But until that point, there's really no point engaging with it. All Alder's razor. So.
Okay, I think maybe there's something I misunderstood about solipsism. I thought it was just the idea that all that exists is just your own experience. So the reason why I asked the question was because I thought that if there is such a thing as objective logic, right? So if there's an objective set of logical laws that distribute over all observers, this would seem to posit the existence of something outside of your mind, and that would itself serve as the counter against solipsism.
That assumes that they're mind independently true. But even then, the laws of logic are descriptive in that respect. And so while they have the appearance from our frame of reference in the universe to be like universal and inviolable, how we describe things, a thing is itself and a thing cannot not be itself. But these are from our frame of reference. When you alter the frame of reference from a mathematical perspective in dimensions, or when you do it like states prior to the Big Bang, where all frames of reference are equal, they occupy the same space, these things break down. Or even at the quantum level, like the basic laws of logic don't hold up at that. So so in that respect, assuming that they are universal and inviolable, and therefore like they are prescriptive of the universe, I don't hold to that. So I hold that they are, from our perspective, from our frame of reference, our lowly frame of reference in the universe, they appear to be universal and inviolable, but that depends upon the state of the universe itself. So they describe how we currently observe things.
Okay, I mean, isn't the common
so
objection to that?
Adam, there are other people in the audience that want to ask questions, so
Okay.
I'm going to pull another one up, and then if we loop back around, we could possibly bring you back up. But I feel like that was pretty good clarification there, so we'll bring up another user. Abysmo was in, and thank you, Adam. We appreciate your time. And Abysmo, I'm pulling you up right now.
Finally, let's go. All right, this is a question for Iconoclast. Given that it seems as though you failed in being able to provide an epistemological justification for the God you perceive is the Christian God, I feel like it is apropos to ask, why are you a Christian? In other words, what is your justification for identifying as a Christian?
Well, I don't feel like I've failed to demonstrate this at all because I'm afraid we never actually got into the meat of what I was setting out to demonstrate because we had to hear the same thing repeated ad nauseum by JL over there. But what justifies me in claiming to be a Christian? Direct divine revelation, personal experience, belief in every word of the Nicene Creed. I mean, pick your poison. I'd say that there's plenty of justification for me personally to claim that I'm a Christian.
All of which, of course, beg the question, but that's just... So.
Yeah, and I find it ironic that you would use a metaphor of poison. All right, that's enough for me.
Thank you, Abysmo. And we'll go ahead and pull up Zen up next.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hey, what's up, Zen?
Hey, I got a question for Iconoclast. By the way, thanks, Taco, for good moderation of this debate. It's nice to watch and listen to. Yeah, I was just confused, Iconoclast. Like, it seems to me like I just gotta ask the question again, but in a different way. Like, can you prove that like your Christian God exists without first assuming he...
No, I do believe that I can prove it. And if you want, send me a DM so I can respond to you. And I'll be happy to share what I believe to be that proof in the form of 3 documents. And you're welcome to pour over them at your leisure and find any holes in them that you might be able to. Just a spoiler, though, I've looked and several others have looked. And it seems that no matter who examines them or analyzes them, it seems to be the case that the possibility of any kind of mindless causal instantiation of the universe fails to meet the basic requirements of instantiation alone or the existence of the universe alone. And by way of time constraints and certain things being empirically justifiable and verifiable in the way that they are, that it necessitates that there must be something that pre-exists Planck 1 or Planck time 1, such that it is capable of instantiating these things. And therefore, I think that gives us a pretty good foundational starting point for some sort of a deity. And from there, build the case as to what that deity would entail, who it is, what its attributes, characters, properties might be. And I think that it necessarily terminates in Christian Trinitarian theism.
Seems to me that the way you're just like trying to build this ideology of yours, of this belief of yours based on an assumption that just like assuming it just seems circular reasoning to me. Just you're not proving anything independent of mind context.
Well, I would have loved to get into that, but you were here for it. I don't need to recap it.
All right, thank you, Taco.
Thank you for coming up. I'm inviting up Portil now.
Hello.
Hey, Portil.
All right. I won't be perfectly coherent because I'm a little sick, but I'll try my best. When you said there were certain requirements for instantiation, could you, sorry, for Iconoclast, could you clarify what you mean by that and how you establish what those requirements are and why the Christian God is the only thing that can meet those requirements.
Sure. The things that are required to give rise to any kind of a physical universe at all are, well, material conditions, space, time, matter, and energy, and laws that govern over them that are in a interdependent causal relationship between them. So I used the example of gravity earlier. And this can be demonstrated mathematically. So by the way of introducing a bijective function, which requires proving surjectivity and injectivity. And then you can declare the system is bijective, such that any change in A necessitates a change in B and vice versa. And according to all observable, cosmological data that we do have, all the way back to Planck time 1, that these things must have necessarily been the case. These bijective relationships, specifically, I have a list here. Give me just a second. I scrolled too far. I apologize. There's this list of the strong coupling constant, the mass ratio precision, the inflation field equations, and Planck time derivation, as well as the gravitational constant, that are provably bijective in their nature and must be the case at the initial inflation event of Planck time 0 to Planck time 1 and beyond. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a physical universe at all. So starting there, is where we would build the case, demonstrating that there's something that exists prior to the universe existing, in order for the universe to exist at all. I think it's a pretty rational starting point. And from there, we can analyze, exactly what it is that this being must be like, what properties it must have in order to do the things that are being claimed that it did do. And I think by way of analyzing these properties, you necessarily end up at the place of it being the Christian God, by way of proving that it's Trinitarian in nature, and no other model that I can think of or have found really manifests in a way that this specific model would necessitate.
Okay. I wish I could dive deep into that, but if you guys will let me, I'd like to ask just one more follow-up question. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
sure.
How do you know, and I'm kind of just repeating what J.L. Warren's saying, how do you establish that these laws are laws that are governing reality from outside of the universe, rather than just descriptions of the universe itself?
Okay, so there's several different ways to classify that specific kind of question. Several different nuances that would change from one to the other. So this idea of it just being a descriptive thing that we use to put onto the universe, not something that must necessarily be the case. Or are we talking about brute contingency, that these things are just brute facts, or is it some kind of a naturalistic model where?
Well, there might be explanations for the way that the universe, the way the universe is, might have explanations, but the laws that we're talking about, that we use to kind of predict the way that nature will act, would be just descriptions of the way the universe naturally is. And the way the universe is would have explanations. Each of those facts would have their own explanations, but they would be in nature, not in some kind of, not outside of it.
So this kind of speaks to this idea of these laws just being self-existent and descriptive, not prescriptive, and we're just observing them. Well, I would say that that these laws, in a purely Platonic sense, have no causal power. They just describe or represent, but they don't do any instantiating or enforcement of these physical outcomes in time and space.
Mm-hmm.
And if these laws were abstract entities, how do they latch onto reality at all, specifically with the time constraints of Planck time 0 going to Planck time 1? What gives rise to these laws? What could possibly order them in such a bijective functional way that allow the cosmos to evolve in the first place? Specifically, when in the context of the simultaneity paradox, it states that, I mean, these things have to be simultaneously the values and the conditions that they govern at the same time, instantly, at the very first Planck moment. Otherwise, we don't have a universe. So it would have to demonstrate some kind of explanatory power that speaks to these points that, yeah, I just don't think it can, and that has yet to be demonstrated to me.
It has yet to be demonstrated that what has explanatory power.
That it just these laws are what they are by way of any kind of a naturalistic machination because of the time constraints and simultaneity paradox.
Has he fully addressed your question, Port? I'd like to move on to the next question.
Not fully, but it would be a good idea to move on. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, we can come back around. If they're cool, take on some additional questions at the tail end. We can go a little bit over the 30 minutes I have allotted for this. But thank you, Portiel. But we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. I think Leo Phileas was up next, so I'll pull up Leo. Hey, man.
Yeah, I had a quick question there for Iconoclast. You said something just a couple minutes ago about something like how do the laws of nature arise? What if they don't?
Then how are they there?
They're
I think
just
everything
there.
in nature arose, right?
But what if? So when you say there, I take it you mean that they're like out there in the world. That they're real.
Well, there isn't they exist in a one-to-one correspondence, right? So the material conditions,
correspondence with what?
the material conditions over which they govern.
What do you mean
Time,
by
space,
govern?
matter, and energy.
What do you
Okay,
mean
so
by govern?
Govern as in describe it with mathematical precision.
But govern usually in this context means like some sort of direction. Are you saying that the laws of nature direct the world to act the ways that it does?
No, I'm saying that these two things are interdependent, that the material conditions depend on the specific values that these laws have.
So I guess what do you mean
so
by material conditions?
Time, space, matter, and energy, the conditions of the material universe.
I would take those to be the objects of the material universe. But so I guess what I'm getting at is what if like the laws of nature are not a thing out in the world? Because there are views out there held by many, not most, but many physicists and philosophers of physics that the laws of nature are not like things out in the world, that they're really just descriptive features of our physical theories about the world. And it seems that might not be an agreeable view to you, but it seems like that's a consistent worldview. Do you think that there's any problem with holding to a view like that?
It sounds almost like you're describing some kind of a nominalist position. Is that right?
Perhaps,
I mean,
yes.
Yeah, I think nominalism fails on a number of different fronts. I think that ultimately that in order to hold to a nominalist position, it in a roundabout way kind of requires affirmation of not only the physical time, space, matter, and energy conditions that we exist within. It requires some sort of an affirmation of those conditions, but also of a metaphysical nature. Like specifically when it speaks to logic in the same way that it would speak to these natural laws, that the laws of logic would be considered in a similar way. And
I could just say the same thing about the laws of logic. They're not things in the world. They're just an aspect of some broader conceptual schema, or are a part of some broader conceptual schema that humans have developed for understanding things.
Well, if we develop them, I would think that we'd be able to change them or circumvent them, or
We can. There are logics where, like, say, the law of non-contradiction is false.
well, it necessarily requires these other models. I think I know what you're talking about, like constructive logic, fuzzy logic. I've read about
Intuitionist logic, dialetheism, yes. And more philosophers are actually turning away from classical logic. Now, they're not moving into any other specific camp, but I think more Western analytic philosophers are realizing that classical logic captures logic very specifically, and that there are certain instances where other logics may be more applicable, that there isn't like one logic that we use for all things.
Well, I think that for these alternate models to have any kind of explanatory power at all, or to make any kind of claims at all, they would necessarily at least have to.
Does logic explain? I don't know if I agree that logic explains. I think it describes, but I don't think it explains.
Well, absent the ability,
at least not
to
in the traditional sense of explanation as a concept.
Well, it's my position that any kind of cognition at all requires a grounding somewhere, a genesis point, right? And I think that starts with identifying something and excluding the contradictory nature of the thing, as in a potato is not a couch and a couch is not a potato kind of deal. And then I think the only one that might even be able to be questioned would be the law of the excluded middle, but that really ultimately depends on the nature of the way you see truth values or truth statements at all.
Yeah, that
someone
those
who
are
believes
generally
that
defined differently across different logics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if your worldview entails that absolute truth claims aren't real or can't be made, then sure.
I mean,
guess
I would say that. I'm not sure what the concept of absolute truth even is. I don't know what that really means. I hear that said all the time. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to capture.
Yeah, it just renders. I'm sorry, it just renders.
Like something is either true or false. I don't know what it means for something to be true absolutely. Unless
Yeah,
by absolutely you just mean universally. I understand like universal truth, but absolute truth is not a phrase that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I don't think it would to most logicians.
But maybe we're using these kind of interchangeably. Maybe I'm using it wrong. But I would say an absolute truth is one that you could be, derived of mathematics. 1 + 1 is 2, or that 1 is a necessary precondition for 2. I don't think that these things change in any possible world.
I mean, I think there's probably possible worlds. But anyway, we don't need to get into a discussion of modality. I was really just curious if you thought that other views about sort of Humean views rather than non-Humean views, which seem to be what you're advocating for, or at least one that you're advocating for. I just was curious what your thoughts were about that. So I'll drop down since there's other people that have their hands raised.
Thank you for coming up, Leo. We appreciate your time. I'm going to pull up AA Batteries up next because he had his hand raised, and then Otangelo after that. Otangelo, what's up, dude? Hey, AA Batteries. Just hang on, Otangelo.
All right, the problem of evil. 2 questions for you, Iconoclast. Why does suffering exist?
Why does suffering exist? I think that suffering is an entailment of living within a fallen world that was designed to not have the suffering, but by way of humans exercising their free will and agency, decided to bring that suffering into the world, and therefore the suffering that we experience is a product of that.
All right. Secondly,
Hey, I'm sorry. Do you mind if I dovetail on that?
Oh yeah, of course.
So the problem with that, what he just described, is that the not God said is the thing that's actualized by the God said. So any of the foundational circumstances within the not God said are actualized by the God. So because the God itself is defined as referencing nothing external of itself, because there's nothing external to act as a referent or something that needs to be appealed to or a constraint upon what it does, then any circumstances in the not God set that would facilitate any kind of outcome can be understood or entailed to be intended by the God itself. So the fact that there is actions and outcomes that we could demarcate as being evil or suffering or whatever, these things are intended by the God. So the fall itself, appealing to that, is unnecessary because the circumstances that allowed for the logical possibility of the fall were absolutely intended by the God if the God were to exist. So, okay, go ahead, AA. Sorry, just wanted to throw that in there.
That's just saying that foreknowledge means that foreknowledge equals causality, and that would be a contradiction.
It's not just foreknowledge.
will.
It's also its omnipotence.
Well, it's the fact that if the God set is the thing that actualizes the not God set,
Hey,
and
JL,
anything that is
this is
anything's largely possible.
This question
Yeah.
is for Iconoclast from AA. Let's
Yeah.
try to let him take the reins.
I just wanted to just dovetail on it. Go ahead, AA. I'm sorry.
No, that was a perfect explanation.
Yeah, you got it.
But would you say that suffering is needed for God to test our faith like other theists, or would you not hold that position?
I don't believe in this whole soul building theodicy style of explanation for suffering. No, I think it's much simpler than that. I think that the world was designed to not include the suffering, but by way of free will being a thing that exists. Also, one of the causal motivators for the existence of human beings at all was the entailment of this free will element. And yeah, we can get into like a deep dive on Genesis and the fall of man and all this stuff if you'd like, but perhaps a different time and different venue.
Well,
but point
I
being
don't know. I don't see free will. I don't see how free will could exist in your worldview. But how could God allow for the unnecessary suffering then of non-human animals if it was humans that resulted in the fall and it was humans that are punished and tested?
Well, if you'll recall, if we're going to exist within the paradigm of this hypothetical, I suppose, in your worldview, God and fall of man that we're criticizing, if you remember, it wasn't man that God cursed; it was the earth that God cursed. So I would say that the suffering of animals, this natural evil, I guess you could call it, is probably a product of that.
And so you're telling me in your worldview, this perfect world that God had created, if hypothetically man never ate the fruit and 1,000,000 years had passed and a baboon had just decided to wander around the tree with the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, and the baboon ate from the tree of the fruit, now the world is now full of sin and the world had fallen. This amazing, beautiful world that God had created just gone because a baboon with no knowledge or any idea what that fruit even is just caused sin.
Did God tell the baboon not to eat, or did he tell Adam and Eve not to eat?
He told Adam and Eve.
Then why would a baboon matter?
Is that not the consequence of eating the fruit? So the point of that is to demonstrate how Adam and Eve were told not to. They were told not to. But yet, now the baboon is punished. The baboon now lives in a world of disease and suffering and sin, even though the baboon had nothing to do with God's command towards Adam and Eve.
Okay, real fast. This will be the last response for AA batteries for my Iconoclast, so we're going to move on to Tangelo. So go ahead.
I'll keep it brief. Real quick, Adam was assigned stewardship, right? This is described in Genesis, where he's told to name the animals, and have dominion over them. So, yeah, if the leader falls, if the steward falls, then it stands to reason that everything downstream of that person, that being, would suffer some consequences. This is just the nature of hierarchy.
All right. Thank you for your time, Iconoclast, J.L. and Taco.
Yep. Do you mind saying something funny from one of the audience members?
For who?
Well, would you mind saying something funny real fast?
What do you need me to say?
One of the B.S. Lewis was asking, can you say oompa loompa doompity doo?
All right. What does he want me to say?
Oompa loompa doopity doo.
All right, I got it. Oompa doompa doopity doo.
That's perfect. Thank you for being a good sport. I appreciate it.
Anything.
We went a little bit over the 30 minutes. You guys mind taking a few more questions?
Yeah, sure.
No, I'm cool.
Cool.
Go for it.
I'll pull up Otangelo.
Hi guys, can you hear me well?
Yeah, you're perfect.
Cool. So good evening, everyone. So this debate tonight is about if Christianity is true, right? So I would like to present JRL a syllogism of a fulfilled prophecy, which in my view is one of the most amazing Old Testament prophecies which confirm Christ as the Messiah. And this is the syllogism, premise 1, Daniel 9:24-27. I'm reading here, okay? Prophesies that the Messiah will appear and be cut off, killed after 69 weeks of years. This is 483 Jewish years of 360 days, which is 173,880 days from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. This decree was issued by Artaxerxes in 444 BC, which is written in Nehemiah 2:1-8. Premise 2, adding 173,880 days, that's 483 Jewish years, to 444 BC brings us to April 3rd, 33 AD, the precise date of Jesus' crucifixion. Premise 3, Jesus fulfilled the key elements of Daniel's prophecy during his ministry and crucifixion. He was cut off, crucified on April 3, 33 AD, fulfilling the 69th week. His death brought reconciliation for sin, ended the need for sacrifices, and inaugurated everlasting righteousness as written in Daniel 9:24. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD fulfilled the prophecy of a ruler's people destroying the city and sanctuary as written in Daniel 9:26. The conclusion, the mathematical precision, historical alignment, and fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in Jesus' life, death, and the subject events of 70 AD provide overwhelming evidence that Jesus is the promised Messiah. So this is, in my understanding, a very powerful evidence that Jesus is the Messiah, and it is one of hundreds, literally hundreds of prophecies in the Old Testament which have been fulfilled in Christ.
Well, I mean, if you're wanting me to respond to it, it's not actually a prophecy because you can't eliminate the possibility that these things were written after the fact. Given that the Book of Daniel is a second century, was written in the second century with a 6th century setting. So, because it's prophesying about things in the future and like that, but the stuff in the Old Testament was known by Jews at the time, even before Jesus was supposedly walking around. So it's literally, you can't eliminate the possibility that the writers, the authors, whoever they might be, because whoever they were, that the writers were not referencing what they knew in order to cultivate a story about a thing coming true. So because we don't have access to those authors and we don't have access to the originals, all we have is a bunch of data. We have a story being told. There's no way to confirm it as being that because and biblical scholarship holds that it likely is by virtue of Christian interpolation that this thing, that the stories about Christ were formulated or basically constructed in order to fit with those prior known stories. So we can't confirm it as being prophecy, unfortunately. And the debate was whether or not the Christian God exists, and of course, even if these things were like predicted, and Jesus and his people had no hand in trying to bring them about via fallacy of post-diction, that they were trying to actively make it look like it was coming true. Even if that were the case, it doesn't entail that a God exists, because it could just entail that Jesus was a heretical cult leader, the David Koresh of Bronze Age Palestine or Iron Age Palestine. So it doesn't confirm the existence of a God. It's a story that's being told that we can't confirm the data of. So we have many stories like that many stories that seem to be prophetic about the tales that they tell, across multiple spectrums. Egypt, in India, numerous cultures that have stories that aren't identical to those. Mesoamericans as well have those in their histories. So for all intents and purposes, it's just a story. It doesn't confirm the existence of a God. It just confirms the existence of people who believed these things about this character Christ and that there was a God that existed.
Yeah, of course, nobody can prove if God does exist and the Christian God does exist or does not exist. All we can do is evaluate the evidence that we have at hand and then eventually come to the conclusion that it is more likely that this God actually exists or not. So
But
it's not about absolute proof, it's about inference to the best explanation.
But it doesn't even do that, because it begs the question of the existence of the God for any of the stuff to be true. You'd have to demonstrate that the God exists and exists as described in order for any of these things to be true by extension of it, because that's begging the question. You have to start from, what do we have? We have a story about people that existed way back when, making claims about people way back when, which means that it literally reduces the probability of these things being true, like substantially. You'd have to go into it with a faith position, which is not a tool for epistemology, so you couldn't know them to be prophecies. You simply have faith that they are prophecies. If you're coming at it from an objective standpoint and a parsimonious standpoint, these are just stories, no different than any stories told in any other culture around the world at various points in history, some of them predating Christianity by thousands of years. So,
yeah, I think you are putting the horse in front, or the cart in front of the horse, because we don't start to have the proof, which is actually what we try to do. We start with the evidence. So we have physical and natural evidence, this physical world, which requires an explanation, and we have scriptures. So we have to make sense of both of these things. And if you think, JL, that the naturalistic worldview, which posits that no God is required, is a superior explanation for our existence, then it's actually also your job. You have also the burden of proof to provide reasons why the no God hypothesis is more reasonable than the God hypothesis. I personally have
it's very easy. It's very easy to do.
And I've never seen a reasonable answer to that question.
Yeah, it's very easy to do. There's no logical contradiction in the non-theistic worldview. Naturalism could very well be the case. There's no logical contradiction there. There's no evidence to indicate that the thing exists at all. There's nothing you could point at. Anything you point at as being evidence of it would be begging the question. It's the most parsimonious response, and it leaves open, if such an entity does exist, then we can incorporate that, because it's not the position absolutely that it doesn't exist, but that the concept doesn't have any explanatory or predictive power, so we don't utilize it. We simply throw the concept onto the pile of things that are unfalsifiable concepts, and we'll come back to it once it's demonstrated to actually be a thing to have contention. So yeah, it's the most parsimonious. There's no logical contradiction, and there's no negative implication of it. It's simply describing the universe the way it is. So that would make it more reasonable, because, like, for example, regulatory theory versus necessitarianism. Necessitarianism is circular at its core, whereas regulatory theory is not, because it doesn't take the position that anything was intended to be a particular way, which would, of course, assume there's a thing to have the intention to prescribe the universe, to prescribe things to dictate how the universe is going to be, like Iconoclast holds. So ultimately, yes, it's the most parsimonious, it's non-circular, and there's no logical contradiction. Therefore, it is more rational to hold to it, until evidence is provided that such an entity exists for any of the things that you're talking about to be demonstrated, would be entailed to be true to at least a probabilistic degree.
Yeah, I think this is a very weak defense, JL. First of all,
I don't care if you think it's weak. I don't think it's weak. It's
hang on, guys. Otangelo, this was a quick audience question for JL. I do have Alley Cat, who had their hand raised, and Space Booties as well. So I'm going to move on to them, and then maybe if they still want to chat with you for a moment, we can bring you back up.
Okay.
Thank you for coming up, Otangelo. We had Alley Cat.
Hey, what's up, buddies? Iconoclast, I have a question for you. How do you respond to the problem of divine hiddenness?
Divine hiddenness?
Yeah.
Schellenberg, yeah.
Yeah, for me, that's not really a problem. Divine hiddenness. Well, starting with the idea that the evidence of God is written across his entire creation, that's apparent to me, having experienced what I have and with the benefit of hindsight. And I would suggest to you that anybody that does experience something similar, I guess is the way I'll put it, it'll be apparent, 100% evident and apparent to them too, just how categorically misattributing these things to non-evidence, that they've been doing their entire existence, because I know that was the case for me. And the hiddenness, hiddenness from who? In what case? From what? The fact that we have any kind of moral compunctions at all, I think is evidence. The fact that existence exists at all is evidence. Yeah, I don't have a problem with divine hiddenness. I think it's just a conceptualization of people who were, presuppose that the God doesn't exist at all.
So you don't think that non-resistant non-believers actually exist?
I would suggest that non-resistant non-believers ultimately become believers.
How do you know that?
If I may
How do we
ask,
not know that?
if I can ask a clarifying question, Iconoclast, just for the sake of it, just so we can clarify. Are you familiar with what? Because none of the things you appeal to are referenced in the argument from divine hiddenness or the argument from non-belief. Are you familiar with Schellenberg's argument there, or does Alicat need to articulate it for you?
Perhaps I just don't understand what divine hiddenness is, but I could have swore I've tangled with this before, and the sentiment is such that, well, if God exists and he wants this reciprocal relationship with his created beings, and he wants these things, then why doesn't he make his presence more known or easier to access?
Go ahead, Ali. I was curious. I wanted to clarify. Yeah. It's all you.
Yeah. So, like, the argument basically says that, like, he loves all of his creation, right? Which means that he wants to have a personal relationship with all of them, which means that he also would want to have a personal relationship with non-resistant non-believers, but these non-resistant non-believers actually do exist. So, like, the question is, like, why doesn't he provide evidence to, like, this group of people that, like, by no fault of their own, like, they're not Christian?
Well, I mean, you'd have to demonstrate to me that these non-existent non-believers at some point haven't.
Not misinterpreted, but I didn't convey like the argument properly. Like, because he isn't like showing evidence to like this group of people that don't believe by like no fault of their own, because like you also claim that he has to be like all loving and shit, right? Like there seems to be a contradiction there, and like therefore like it can exist.
That presupposes that he's not showing the evidence, and it presupposes that we're not making a category error when we see evidence and don't label it as evidence.
That's not what it's doing at all. It's not presupposing it. What it's doing is that the God is not giving the evidence in a way that is understandable by the individual agent, and that ostensibly it could do that and not simply present what it thinks is evidence and then hope that other people come across it and interpret it in the right way. It would do it in a way that is completely unambiguous to every single person on the planet. The reasonable non-belief is the thing that occurs.
But we decide. But hold on, we decide how we interpret the things that we see. We decide what our impression is based off of the sense data that we gather and collect.
That's irrelevant. It's irrelevant.
And how we extrapolate that data into what the meaning behind that data is. And if we decide that this isn't relevant to the God thing existing or not existing, then how much more do you expect him to do? The evidence has been supplied. It's up to you to interpret it without these preconceived notions of, well, that's not evidence for God, obviously, because
JL, this is a question from Alicat to Iconoclast.
Yeah.
Oh, it's fine. So you're saying that the evidence is already there, but these like people that I'm talking about that want to believe in God, but the evidence just isn't provided like so clearly to them, like those people don't exist. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that it wasn't provided to you. I'm saying that we're all provided the same set of data, the same set of evidence to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
But through that lens,
I'm not saying that like you're provided evidence. Like I'm not provided evidence, right? But why is it that he wants to have a loving relationship with all of his creation, but only like some of it end up like and have this relationship with him?
Well, again, that's presupposing that only some of it gets to have that relationship. And look, this isn't a popular, well, maybe it's more popular than I thought because I keep running into like minds on this front, but I don't subscribe to infernalism whatsoever. I reject it outright. I do hold pretty tightly to a universalist position. So I think that ultimately they all do experience that. So this idea of hiddenness and evidence not being clear, I think is a category error on the part of the agent, not necessarily a hiddenness feature on the part of God.
Okay, maybe I need to post like the argument in the chat.
Yeah, I don't think he's right. I don't like the syllogism itself, like Sheldon, but either one, like his easier one or his longer one, I think it would probably be helpful because none of this stuff is relevant to the argument itself. Because the standard of evidence is what's dictated by the God. The God can dictate what the standard is. So it would know that one simple standard would not apply equally to every single person on the planet simply by virtue of those things. So it could reveal that evidence in a way that would convince every single person simultaneously in a way that would convince them. There's nothing constraining it from doing that, and yet it doesn't do that. So non-resistant non-belief does exist. Like I am a non-resistant non-believer. If the God demonstrated itself to exist in a way that I could know it,
JL, let's not go into the extra. Alley Cat, did that summarize your argument?
Yeah, maybe I'll just have to send you the argument, Iconoclast.
Cool.
I'm looking at it. If there is no God, he is perfectly loving. If a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. Well, kind of reject P2 right out of the gate, but reasonable non-belief occurs, no perfectly loving God exists, hence there is no God. I think that it falls apart at premise 2. Reasonable non-belief does not occur. What that really hinges on what we would define reasonable as reasonable non-belief,
which is what I articulated. If belief requires the commission of a logical fallacy, or feelings
Jail, this is a question from Alley Cat to Iconoclast. Do you have anything else you'd like to include with that, Alley Cat, or is that sufficient for now?
Iconoclast, can you show me what you're looking at right here with reasonable non-belief? Because I'm looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia and I don't see that.
I just Googled it real quick, and it says on Wikipedia this is Schellenberg's Hiddenness argument. So I got a short form and a long form. I was reading to you the short form.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you answered my question, but all right.
Perfect, thank you. I'll go ahead and pull up the next person. We had Space Booties, and then I see Ego. If anybody else would like to come up, JL and Iconoclast are being gracious with their time and willing to take some more questions. I think there were also a couple more on the YouTube chat, but we'll get through all these and they'll move into the closings.
Hey, thanks, guys. Appreciate the discussion so far. It's been interesting to listen to. This is for JL Warren.
What's up?
And before I state the question, I'm not here to argue for the Christian God, but I'm wondering if you do believe in the possibility of other worlds. And then I have a follow-up.
It's logically possible that there could be. As far as my position right now is it's indeterminate. So, and it would be irrelevant. I don't have access to them. Nobody has access to them. So making statements about them would be pure, speculation. And, so sure, there could be other possible worlds. We don't know. We may never know. Maybe one day we will. But until we cross that threshold, it's really not that important to me.
All right, fair enough. Do you mind if I set up a syllogism, or if you're already aware of Plantinga's argument, you can just go on that.
I'm familiar with Plantinga's redefinition of omniscience in order to push God into the logical possibility issue, so that the logical problem of evil doesn't exist for it, and his theodicy to try and argue around it, and it fails. Ultimately, because God is still the set from which all logically possible not God sets arise. And the problem is, if omniscience is knowing all true propositions infallibly, because God's perfect nature, and therefore its knowledge would be perfect by extension, so therefore its knowledge cannot be otherwise, because perfect is logically entailed to be unchanging. It cannot improve or be different from what it is, because it is perfect. So even if multi-world theories was proven, then any true proposition in any logically possible world would be known by the God. And so because it is the thing that actualizes those worlds, then those propositions cannot be otherwise. So it still doesn't get around it, because it still doesn't get around the logical possibility of the logical problem of evil. From the way Epicurus, the way Epicurus and Hume kind of articulated it, I have a different articulation on the logical problem of evil that goes towards God and what it must do and what it must do and what it wants to do, which is a little bit a different attack at it. But I get Plantinga's argument there, what he was trying to do, but it's not very satisfactory because he just redefines omniscience to get around the logical contradiction.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's all I got.
Not a problem.
Thank you, Space Booties. And then Ego.
Hello.
What's up?
Yo, I'm only coming in on the tail end. I was doing other stuff today, so I don't know what you guys have discussed so far in your discussion.
Okay.
However, the main problem for me I'm like very agnostic.
So do you have a question for one of the guests?
Yes, I'm articulating.
Oh, perfect.
So for me, the main problem is that like we're talking about like interpretation, right? And interpretation is always going to be obviously true, like a certain subject. There's never going to be a neutral interpretation. But it seems that when we like discuss theism versus atheism, you like, I don't know how to put it. I've always found it very strange that like one can argue for the Christian God, but like just the possibility of a powerful deity is like ruled out, right? Like one of the features of a Christian God is that he's a personal God, but I've just never quite been convinced of that. I have no like personal spiritual experience with that myself, and other people's testimony has just not convinced me. So maybe Iconoclast can like you don't have to like answer to it or like whatever, but like explain your experience.
So I guess I'm confused. Do you want to know why I believe that some sort of deistic model or some kind of monadic deity or some kind of Unitarian model just doesn't suffice for me? Or are you asking me for my personal I hate to sound sanctimonious, but testimony of sorts? I mean, what is it exactly that you're asking?
Well, it's more so that like if we're gonna have like a conversation where we grant like metaphysics and like the Kalam argument or something, how do we get to the Christian God? Maybe that's like the easiest way to phrase it.
Sure. I think that there's a self-referential problem that other monadic deities or deist models run into necessarily. For instance, I would suggest that the Christian God, uniquely being Trinitarian in nature, satisfies the requirements for the grounding of logic, truth, and morality, such that if it was a single deity, right, a single identity, then whatever this identity decides is true is just necessarily true. It doesn't mean it's the truth. It just means that this deity decides that it's the truth. That would make truth mind.
Yeah, you get like horn one of the Youthford dilemma. I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, same thing with morality and logic. There has to be a witness. There has to be some sort of independent verification, right? And I just don't see that any non-Trinitarian model would satisfy that demand.
Okay, yeah, I'm not that familiar with Trinitarianism. I always found it kind of like confusing, to be honest. It just never clicked to me. But sure, it like has this unique property that attests to it better than like other things. But like this is kind of debate bro language, but like what you just gave me sounds like precept logic, right? Just like Christianity is true because out of all worldviews, this particular instantiation of like a concept explains these things the best, right? But again, there we have like the force of interpretation, right? That's kind of yeah, that doesn't seem like a neutral observation to me at all. So I'm still like kind of confused on how you get there. I get your answer with like the Trinitarian God, but like how does the Trinitarian God do that? Because the witness or something?
Well, I think it's by functional dependence alone. Like, for instance, logic without truth has no content, or truth without morality lacks any kind of normative force to it, or morality without logic is just like everything else, incoherent. And
Well, I mean,
any
no,
attempt.
logic and like morality and all these things aren't like incoherent. That's my main like this again is presupper logic, right? Like you have to deny the possibility of like other worldviews having a coherent account. But like there's a lot of religions and there's a lot of like metaphysical systems, right? Like I don't know how to put it to you. It's again like already like a pretty loaded interpretation. We're like, yeah, maybe I'm jumping the shark here, but I just don't see it.
Well, I think what, well, just hearkening to a non-theist or non-biblical source, I would probably cite to the PSR. States that every existence must have a sufficient reason for it, and I think that the Trinity provides a self-explanatory foundation that prevents this kind of infinite regress that I don't see any way around if this
Well,
deity is some kind of a monadic structure.
yeah, I can give you an account right now. Arthur Schopenhauer. I'm not that familiar with his work, but I was reading a collection of his works lately with a pretty good introduction. Arthur Schopenhauer like has a metaphysical system. He's an atheist. He integrates the PSR with the fourfold root of reason, right? Like he has like a pretty coherent, parsimonious metaphysical system that's completely atheistic. So for me, that's already like one account that's like pretty coherent. So then I would like need a motivating reason to choose out of one of these metaphysical systems, right? Or accounts. And so we're like back to square one. Do you get like I need like something special for to carry me to the Christian God claim, right? I hope that's not like too high of a burden, but it feels pretty reasonable to me.
Well, no, I think for the individual that's it's perfectly reasonable, right? What separates this model from the others when it comes to providing whatever metrics it is that would be judged for determining the success or failure of the model.
Right.
So the PSR seems to be described, eloquently enough or sufficiently enough through Schopenhauer's. I'm not familiar with the guy's work, to be honest, but
Right.
through his model. But I would suggest that there's something that there's at least something in it that, or there's at least something in existence, I should say, that probably isn't sufficiently addressed. And absent knowledge of it or having looked into it, I wouldn't be able to answer to exactly what that is.
Right. So sorry, I name dropped Schopenhauer, right? My point with Schopenhauer is that he just has like a metaphysical account, right? Like he has a coherent metaphysical account. So like the whole like, oh well, my worldview integrates PSR and Trinitarianism. Therefore it's like most motivating to me for these accounts of things. Things have like direct accounts for these properties themselves. Maybe not the Trinitarian morality thing, their conception is different. But aside from that, like, I don't know. Sorry, you wanted to say something. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, no worries. I was just gonna ask, like, does it get you from an is to an ought? Does it ground moral objectivity? Does it make any kind of value judgment on the nature of truth? Like, can there be absolute truths, or is there any kind of grounding foundation for these different things? I mean, I don't know. I'd have to look at his model and to give you more precise feedback.
Yeah, so Schopenhauer's metaphysics is like a Kantian system, right? Like, I'm gonna be honest, I'm like not a genius, so I don't like have a full comprehension of Kant and Schopenhauer like in a week, right? Since I started reading this, but my point was more so that like other metaphysical systems can account for like these things that you kind of require of a worldview. We can have that nuanced discussion, right? Like how the Schopenhauer. I just let's not like have me explain Schopenhauerian metaphysics, right? Like morality and truth work differently. I'm pretty sure that like he's one of the first animal ethicists in the Western canon because he's kind of like a Buddhist, right? And like everything suffers, so you have to deny your own will, right? I think it's pretty cool. I don't agree to it fully, but that would be an example. Truth would also just be the world in itself, without our representation, that we can only access through our representation. As I said, it's an interesting metaphysical system, but this leads me to another question, and that is, another thing that makes me quite skeptical of your interpretation is that you seem to like require the universe to have certain features like objective morality or PSR or whatever. These questions are all like metaphysical accounts to me that are indeterminate. I'm very skeptical of them. That's my bias, I'll be honest. But I don't think like the world needs to conform to like certain standards that I think of. I think the world just is, and we can discover that, right? Like, and so presupposing a metaphysical system or account that integrates objective morality and then saying, well, all these accounts don't do that is very odd, right? It's like a very selective interpretation. What would you say to that?
I would say that absent objectivity, morality doesn't exist. It just reduces to opinion and preference. And I think that that leads to some pretty serious epistemic issues when it comes to the nature of what is good and what is not, and any kind of true claim that you can make on it. As far as
well, I'm personally I'm a error theorist, right? I think all moral exclamations are false, but I'm also a vegan, right? Because I think like climate change is real. So morality, absent of like having an objective grounding in God, just becomes a way of how you relate to stuff, right? And the consequences that happen. I'm not like a true, like a hardcore utilitarian or some shit like that, right? I guess I'm a pragmatist. But this raises me again to like.
So last part of the question, and then we're going to move on to the text ones, and then we'll do the closings.
Sure. Back to the moral thing, right? You're just kind of like presupposing that it like is incoherent to have an account of morality like that because it doesn't have truth property, which is like the exact thing I'm critiquing in your interpretation. You're like already like forcing a certain way for the universe to work, right?
Well, I think it's part of the worldview that, well, put it this way, we all have worldviews, and in my worldview, absent some kind of an objective standard to compare actions and decisions and thoughts and these other things to, then it really does just reduce to opinion or preference. And in that case, then the thing in question, which would be morality, which I would describe as like a binary categorization system for human thought and behavior, wherein morality has an interest. That's not to say that all decisions have a moral weight to them. For instance, I don't think that there's a moral weight to deciding which pair of socks to put on in the morning or when you're getting ready for the day. But anywhere that there is a moral implication, if it is just arbitrary or if it is just a matter of opinion or preference, then where do we get this idea of good and bad or good and evil or right and wrong existing at all?
Yeah, I don't believe in good and bad. So that's the problem, right? Like for me, a worldview doesn't require that. But it's okay. I think we're looping. I don't want to take up too much time. Thank you for answering my questions.
If I could dovetail on that really quick, the concepts like the distinctions between things that are right and wrong and good and bad, that these are these are valuations, and these moral valuations are informed by our moral intuitions. Our moral intuitions are informed by our evolved capacity for empathy. So it's our limbic system in response to other things around us that we are using as reference points to indicate to us individually what are good and bad and right and wrong. That moral relativism doesn't hold that there are objective distinctions here, but that actions and outcomes are intrinsically or inherently amoral, and that the designation of moral or immoral is imposed by the agents that are observing them and interpreting them. So that's that.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly it. And objective, and even if a God existed, objective morality, mind independently true moral valuations could not exist because everything would predicate upon its mind. So objective morality is not a thing that exists. So
well, I can propose a theistic model that it is still mind independent.
We'll let Iconoclast finish here, and then we're going to go ahead and move on to a few text questions. And thank you.
I apologize for dragging it on, but I do got to get going soon, kiddos and whatnot. But yeah, how to do this concisely? Okay, it wouldn't necessarily be mind dependent if this morality, or if one side of the other of morality, good or evil, was ontologically grounded in the being that's defining or determining it itself, such that hypothetically, if the God that I believe in is real and he is immutable, means doesn't change, then good is just ontologically part of that being. and that being doesn't change, then it necessarily would follow that this is not a mind-dependent thing, as in, I don't believe that God decides what is good or evil. Good or evil just is determined by whether or not it is in comport with the being that determines it, meaning I don't think that evil is a created thing. I don't think it has its own ontos. I think that privation theory is the most accurate way to look at this. And in that realm, it wouldn't necessarily be mind dependent, because not even God decides what is right or wrong. He just is who he is, what he is, ontologically so. And that is the determining factor, not any kind of decision made by any mind, whether it's ours or one of the infinite.
Yeah, the problem is that there's nothing there for the God to reference to make coherent distinctions. So basically saying God is good is just saying God is God. That's all that entails that. So go ahead, Taco.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question, because that was a question for Iconoclast, right? And this one will be, and then I think there was another one for you, Jail, but this is from Earl, and that's, how does an all-knowing perfect being experience regret? An example would be after the flood, they did a rainbow.
Experience regret. Well, you can know things prior to the thing happening and still regret that it happened, because I reject this idea that foreknowledge equals causality.
That's not what that entails.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
And then another question for Jail Warren. This is from Numenon. If the brain in a vat could be made to believe false things, couldn't the law of non-contradiction be a false belief forced upon you?
Well, we'd have to determine that those things are false. We'd have to have a mechanism to determine that those things are false. So, I mean, we're still talking about whether or not it can be determined whether it is a brain in a vat. So, yeah, you could. I guess you could have a brain in a vat and convince it of false things. But those things are going to be false in relation to things that are true. So I don't really see the point of that. It's kind of like the if you're talking about the impossibility of it, I don't know if they're still going towards hard solipsism, like hard solipsism being logically impossible, which it's not. There's no logical contradiction there. He's just talking about a certain situation in the event of hard solipsism that you could do something to a brain. Okay, but the system that the brain exists in, you're feeding it things that's false information, but it still exists within a system, which the brain itself is not the container that it's in. So the law of identity still applies, and so does the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle. By simply the thing existing, it entails that these things are consistent. So I don't know. Could you convince it of false things? Sure. It doesn't mean those things are universally false. I don't know where they're jumping the gap here. So it's a weirdly worded question.
Gotcha. And then Mosey had one for Iconoclast. Would the simulation theory trump the existence of God?
I think it faces a regress issue. If beings built our simulation, their universe must also have laws or constants or technology that allows such simulation to take place at all. The question of any of the things that we tried to touch on this evening, whether it be fine tuning or the transcendentals with the grounding of things like morality, truth, logic, these kind of things, it's just merely pushed up one level without any ultimate explanation. I think that this would also require intelligence. Even a simulator hypothesis affirms the need for a mind or minds with knowledge, power, etc., which this aligns more with the position that I was putting forward than it is any kind of refutation or rebuttal of it. And I don't think that it escapes. I don't think that it would escape these things as being true, because the simulation has to have some simulator. And if those beings or the framework that hosts them are themselves contingent or mindless, the same argument of impossibility would apply. So ultimately, you still need a necessary grounding, some kind of.
I think they were asking about the Christian God, though. Would that still align with the Christian God?
Okay, so simulation aligning with the Christian God? Well, I
Yeah, because
suppose
they were asking if it would trump the existence of the Christian God, and you're saying it'll go like one level up, and then there would be a God of that reality. So would that still align with the Christian God?
well, I think there is only one God, and if there is a simulation, then is God running the simulator? So, can I rule it out on a logically impossible basis? No, not really. I mean, it's possible that this reality is just an illusion of sorts that it were consciously inserted into in some way. But does it rule it out? No, I don't think that any kind of simulation hypothesis or simulation theory rules out or trumps the Christian God. I just think it faces an infinitely regressive chain of, well, who's simulating the simulators? Who's simulating that simulator? And it doesn't provide any kind of explanatory power.
Gotcha. And Wise Ape, I see your hand raised, but we're closing down the Q&A right now. I'm sorry, bro, you were a little bit late there, but we'll move into the Q&A here. The Q&A is going to start. Not Q&A. I'm misspeaking. I'm sorry. We're moving into the closing. One of those days. So you'll both have 5 minutes on the closings. Iconoclast, since you're the affirmative, you'll have your 5 minutes first. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll go ahead and start the timer.
Yeah, I'm going to be pretty brief. So just fire away.
Cool. Timer started now. Go ahead and do your closing.
Yeah, I wish this conversation could have gotten off the ground in a more meaningful way. Probably poor time management on my part, because that 30 minutes that I had to do the cross exam just flew by, it seemed. But to answer the question that JL repeated over and over again about proving that a God exists absent some kind of context or mind, I think we could point to things like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is kind of why I brought it up early on, and I probably should have stuck to that more ardently. But yeah, perhaps in future discussions we'll be able to dive deeper into this, because I think the barrier that ultimately led to this conversation really not going very far was the presupposition that was being made that by asserting something that I'm trying to imply something of theological nature, when in reality it was an effort in quite the opposite direction. And I don't think that we ever got to discover whether or not it was begging the question, because we never got to travel far enough down the path. So perhaps in future discussions we'll be able to hammer those kind of details out and arrive at a meeting of the minds. But unfortunately for tonight, doesn't seem to be the case. So I think that's really about all I had. Can't think of anything else to add specifically. So go ahead, JL. Tell us.
Gotcha.
Tell us how the silly theist failed in every meaningful way.
All right, JL, I'm going to go ahead and start. And thank you, Iconoclast. And JL, I'm going to go ahead and start the timer whenever you're ready. Let me know when you're ready. You've got 5 minutes.
I'm ready.
All right.
As I have demonstrated via examining the logical entailments of my interlocutor's accepted attributes of the Christian God and found them to be in logical contradiction, it follows that this entity does not exist. I've also demonstrated that other attributes, whether generally accepted or fringe, can be shot down by examining those logical entailments, which also result in the particular God either not existing or being rendered completely unfalsifiable, and as such there exists no rational justification for making the claim that such an entity exists. The various logically valid arguments for the existence of the God, such as the transcendental, the teleological, the ontological, cosmological, or even moral arguments, all fail as well, because they argue from the position that not only does the entity exist, but that it is defined in a specific way, but because those two propositions cannot be demonstrated to be true, independent of mind and context, they do not serve as evidence of its existence, merely assertions that would be true were it to exist, and ultimately beg the question of the entity's existence. So ultimately, regardless of how the God is defined, it falls to the positive claimant who assumes the burden of proof to demonstrate the truth of their claim in order to establish rational justification for making claims about external reality, such as this entity existing. As my opponent has failed to do so, has not provided any functioning explanatory or predictive model that makes better explanations and more accurate predictions than the naturalistic ones we currently operate with, that he has not identified any logical contradiction in the non-theistic worldview, that his position is predicated upon personal incredulity, emotional appeals to mystery and magic, and begging the question, we can conclude that the claim that the Christian God exists is not one that is rationally justified to make. Thus, as generally defined, the Christian God does not exist, and beyond that there exists no rational justification to claim that it does, beyond being the pure abstracta within my opponent's mind. thank you again, Taco, and to the Politics Discord and to the audience.
Perfect. Thank you, both of y'all. There's not really enough people left in the... I was going to do a poll when we had 30-something, but it's a little bit less than that in this audience here, so we'll just skip that portion. But I do appreciate both y'all joining us today. This was a great debate. Thank you for giving us some extra time for the audience Q&A. I'm sure the audience absolutely appreciates that. If you want to chat after we get off at the stage, feel free to join the religion channel. I'm sure JL Warren's... Are you going to be around, or are you heading out?
I've got my live stream going right now, so I'm gonna chat with them for a bit. And so if anybody wants to pop over to my live stream, I'll be there. I'll possibly be over in the Politics Discord as well a little bit later. I do have some work I have to do, so but yeah, I'll try and catch somebody. But if you have any questions, you can email them to me via my channel, or you can pop over and ask them in my live chat.
Cool. After show at JL's stream, that's Bridge the Divide, JL Warren. I don't know how it's listed on there. I also linked to Iconoclast YouTube in the YouTube description. And then everybody in both audiences, mine and JL's, if you're not on the Politics Discord yet, make sure you join the Discord. It's a great Discord. Lots of great conversations go on here. That's https://www.discord.gg/politics. So make sure everyone joins the Discord and comes and chat with us in the future. I'm going to go ahead and close this out here in just a moment. I do appreciate everybody in all the audiences being here and listening to this debate. You're all amazing. Thank you so much, everybody. Iconoclast and JL, do either of you have any plugs or anything you want to do real fast before I close this out?
Yeah,
Nope.
just if you dig this, if you dig my content, if you dug this, then feel free to pop over to my channel. And if you like it, like, share, and subscribe. And be sure to check out Breakfast Taco's channel. He does amazing stuff. There's some amazing debates coming up on Taco's channel. Some really interesting stuff. So go check it out. He's got it all scheduled. So yeah, Politics Discord, Breakfast Tacos, Bridge the Divide. Check out Iconoclast if you like. The links are all available in the description. So come and hang out with us.
Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, I am scheduling more debates. You don't have to be a big YouTuber. I'm not a big YouTuber, right? Feel free to send me a message on Discord or an email, breakfasttacosemail@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to see if I can't get you involved in a debate. I've had a lot of atheists reach out. We do need more theists. I'd love to have some more theists on. Yeah, this is a ton of fun. I appreciate all the interest, and everybody have a wonderful evening. I'm closing this out now. Thank you again, and